Tashidile, good morning. Welcome to the second day of our event at the Royal Geographical Society, London, organized by the Office of Tibet, London, and the Tibet House Trust. Today also starts the London Climate Action Week, which is a nice coincidence, I think. So for the first session, we now have the welcome address by His Excellency Mr. Sonam Frazi, the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Northern Europe. Sonamla, please.
Tashidelek, good morning. I think because we have more Tibetans here, I'll say a few things in Tibetan first. And during today, Bergi Kuyuk Tola conference is so ni and Peppa, so Mazos Sapembe Nimoti, Kang Mamaji, Pertuaki, Tapshetang, Tatita Chabayi, and Tandeki Kuyuki Tola. Ani tati cheye ta tuzo raya toson ta tinte angaso le lawchi ragi mewa ta yang yang su goga ragi mewa songza angaso bebe ki labadu bebe shunje ki beki kuyu ki tola dona shu chenpu che ko di shiuji ge chenpu 차디 요래 아니가 된저 레고 그거네 디 개침부 시우지기스 라이 된다 때와디 견라미마치든 개갑기 벽이 로미 톱다 벽이 최다 리숑 벽이 ter 벽이 신나 벽이 춘저 망보스 아니 교주디게디 토라 당제 나조 나규네 예베 카와 강젠바 세기 식디 라엘라 니가 첨부 차대요레 삼기요 롱압주 죽주기 제라 벽이 캬롬 아주 캬롬 라웨나 glaciers 캬롬 디게디 슈네 벽 낭네 아니 교주 단다 잠볼링 하바도 에시아기 나라 교대기 교주디게디 차바 메바이나 교주 삼조제기 니갈레 되어레 딘데송사 하바도 말아서 베기 디토라 로종체다 디토라 랭귀베 디셰게 개침부 쇼지 동기예스라이 안 드링킹 아주데 손두디 아니 남규이나 딘데 고갑 라고요 말에 자외 디가서 벽이 시주냠시 관계 레시직 차디열에 디기 진다디 먼저 유럽 지도 계급 EU기 전제규니 지거래 안딘데 선상 원에 제바이나 단다 다람사라라 구리욕이 정도디 대소에 라틴 케티어레 당아주기 내가 망보지 제니 아니 갸가라 코비드 슈침부 슈질랩제 컨트로버셜 드레 제브레 근데 컨트로버셜 드레 제 사회 제라 나도 COP26 디 잉글랜드 유튜브가다 당아주 데네 슈지 갸바이나 안 데라 구조테기 디시 시사 체지 그래 삼제 안 프린도 체제 아주 도 손데 고수버레 아니 아주 얘기 부구시에 때와들라 안 베바치용기 디토라 도난다 아니 남버소기 소수기 MP 아니 롭다 디게들라 벽이 구유ቆ라 계적강 마마시에 두에디 휴지 개심부르샤 달로 COP26 나라 계적디 구유 돌게시거래 남시 규도설 게시거래 아니 가서 베베기 베베 내단디 시에고야 고살라 아니 고고야 디게디 소마도바 이나 아니 낭매를 치니 매바라고 지차도를 삼기도 강하잖아 벽이 구육기 남시 규도 기계 시에바이나 딩상 COP26기 된다 때와디 Arctic and Antarctic 디기 결혼 디게디 쉬니 속이 소대 첨부차니 아니 속이 길이 예배 속이 담을 예배 아니 미디게디 괜찮 첨부 연구를 삼제 디기 배 내가 망제 디기 더 로어래 딘데선자 벽이 구유다 벽이 구유기 내다 규주 견쇼기와 디게디 나라서 시험하도 있나 안 디게디 낭매를 치니 아니 건축이 간절히 타주 제바이네 아니 디게디 나와를 매바치니 타주 로시바치레 삼고요 제사 디 간주 상막이 비구셔야 되라 아니 베바치용기 도난난고에 안 사바도 MP당 가와 고갑라바이네 kuyu keji xie, kuyu keji xie ba ina, yang azu kamit la inji minji kapte ja che sumbu sokwe yo mare, pyogi nedun di pe kechi mbuji yo chagru gore, pyo rang la zi ba ina, pyo rang nang la, pyo pa mangbu ki sozu so le tang ni kuyu ki tola, kamit tonglen che ni, lega 제게 빼마시 망보여 디게디 개미기 아니 가제바레 슬랍제 정갈로 투저당 지거래 디게디랑 알아서기 동sem냠게 무엇이 맞도 바이네 코리오고 돌아 랭겐지 베랑기 베미랑기 심제 제토바이나 아니 계신부 시우지 레삼기 예수여인 and with this I want to say I think only few of you are new but some of you have been here yesterday already, but I want to really emphasize that with this conference, we want to make sure that when COP26 comes about, the decision is not purely made for the coastal regions because they have more advocacy coming from the glacier meltdown from Antarctic and Arctic region, but the glacier melts of the Tibetan Plateau and also other mountain areas needs to take into account. So that's very important for us as a climate vulnerable people to be able to advocate this is very important, and all our friends here will do the same, I hope. The only thing I want to say in addition is really, for thousands of years, the Tibetans have created a community, a simplicity, non-violence, and respect for environment in the belief that our spiritual well-beings are intrinsically linked with the rivers, the mountains that are surrounding us. And we all created an atmosphere in Tibet that everything is shared with, not just for the people in there, but for all sentient beings in Tibet. So that is really the crux of how Tibetan environmental principle is based. One thing for sure is we are a desalinated community, but the impact on climate change in Tibet is an international phenomenon which needs sustained and thoroughly worked out international pressure to bear. Since 1987, His Holiness has visualized that Tibet will be a zone of peace. And it's not military or political peace, but it's really an environmental peace, which is really in the heart of Tibetan understanding of our environment. I just want to say that this conference has taken many months of planning, many helps from friends and supporters, and I want to say thank you for the contributions from all the speakers and my team from the Office of Tibet, who has worked very hard to make this conference a reality. So with this, I want to say, maybe I've taken a little bit more time than I'm allotted. I want to say that we always wish a long life, long and healthy life for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and that we are always guided by His presence and will be always cherished His Holiness's blessings, which we had received for this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commander. Indeed, it has been a very busy week on public discourse about the Tibetan Plateau. In Dharamsala, India, the Tibet Policy Institute is holding the 3rd Tibet Environment Conference concurrently as we speak here. In New York, Columbia University held a webinar on understanding the climate issues of the Tibetan Plateau 2 days back. So the more discourse, the better, of course, for us, and it's much welcomed. So coming back to the whole here and to what we're going to cover today, I believe you and we made a conscious decision to be here today because we have shared values and shared aspirations. We care about our planet. We care about our well-being and the well-being of all other inhabitants of the planet. We are mindful of our action and behavior, and we want to make a change. As global citizens, as British citizens, as people who are custodians of the Tibetan heritage, we will be looking at 2 primary issues here today. The number 1 is the 4 goals of the UK government's presidency of COP26. That is mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. And the second issue is the climate issues of the Tibetan Plateau and how it fits in within the broader framework of achieving the 4 goals of the UK presidency for COP26. We have 4 distinguished speakers today. After listening to them, at the end of the session, we will ask you, the audience, to share your thoughts, your ideas, and recommendations on how we can make sure that the discussions, the negotiations at the COP26 gives space, and rightful so, for Tibetan voices and the issues affecting the climate change of the Tibetan Plateau. So each speaker will be given 30 minutes to speak, and then another 15 minutes to take question answers from the audience, those who are here as well as those joining us online. Please do make full use of this interactive session. So our first speaker is Dr. Martin Mills from Aberdeen University. Dr. Mills is the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research and the secretary of the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on Tibet. He has also done extensive field study and research in the Himalayan regions. He will be speaking on climate change on the 3rd pole. Dr. Mills.
Thank you. Yes, hello everyone. Many of you were here yesterday, and you heard my discussions and talk on, largely speaking, the Asian consequences of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. Today, since we have many Tibetans here who have been kind enough to come, I thought I might focus a little bit more on the Tibetan Plateau specifically. It's largely the same talk, but with some extra stuff that you may be particularly interested in. Just to give some introduction for those who weren't here yesterday, as I say, I'm the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. We support the cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament, the cross-party group on Tibet. We've done that for about 15 years. It's a good combination of parliament and university work. So I'm a scholar, I'm not an activist, I'm not a politician. My job is to simply say what is true, particularly in this case from a kind of scientific perspective. The cross-party group in 2019 inaugurated a climate change inquiry into the effects of climate change on the third pole region, and what that looked like both now in the last 50 years, the present situation, and the situation ongoing as is projected for the next 50 to 150 years. So obviously the future is a guess for all of us, but I'm going to show you what, roughly speaking, the scientific material has as its best guess. As far as that's concerned, we looked at something on the lines of 900 scientific publications to get a sense of this. We didn't look at activists and campaigning material. We specifically looked at scientific material from around the world, from every source that we could find: the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Tibetan Environmental Desk, ICIMOD, scientific establishments across Europe, across America, Canada, and so forth. And the overwhelming conclusion of that review was published quite recently in January. You can see it on the slide. Which is a, roughly speaking, 40-page report that summarizes those scientific conclusions. But I can summarize it fairly simply in one single sentence. The Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding third pole region are undergoing right now a major ecosystem shift. That ecosystem shift will be catastrophic for the Tibetan Plateau and for the communities living in it for the next 50 years. And it will also be catastrophic for the larger industrial, agricultural, and population carrying capacity of Asia over the next century. That ecological shift has, effectively speaking, undermined the one thing that was most distinctive geologically and environmentally about the Tibetan Plateau, and that is what we would often refer to as the cryosphere, or the domain of ice. Now, that word translates quite simply to a certain extent into one of the oldest Tibetan names for Tibet, which is Kawachen. You find that word, as Tibetans here will know, the Tibetan written record goes back some 1,300 years to the foundation of the Tibetan written language under the Emperor Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century. And we know from those records that many of which date back all the way to the sort of, roughly speaking, to the 9th century is the earliest records that we've got, that Tibet has had a consistent, deep, cold cryosphere that has constituted, effectively speaking, the heartland of its culture, of its history, and of its lifestyle and of its economy. And what we also know is that many of the things that were recorded back then are now gone. Let me choose a couple of examples, since there are Tibetans in the room. If you read, for example, the Zanglingma, which is an 11th century text about Guru Rinpoche, it speaks of how Mutsame, the great war goddess of Shangshung in western Tibet, went into battle against the great Guru Rinpoche in the valleys of Mangyul as he was traveling towards Kirong, and sought to crush him and his party between two great glaciers at the head of Mangyul. Those glaciers are now gone, and they have disappeared within the last century. If you read the Kachem Kokolma, the pillar testament given by the mad woman of Lhasa to the great adept Atisha Dipamkara in, roughly speaking, the 11th century, which shows the testament of Songtsen Gampo, he speaks of the great glacier in the village of Dip to the south of Lhasa that was the shape of a conch shell that was just like the speech of the Buddha himself. We know that that glacier was still in its great magnificence during the time of the 5th Dalai Lama, who mentions it in his Sungbum. But we also know that it was there in the 19th century, and we know, I certainly know since I went there in 2015, that it is now entirely gone. The cryosphere of the Tibetan Plateau is depleting and disappearing as we speak, and has been for nearly a century, but most particularly since the 1960s. So let me move from those texts to something a little bit more up, sort of now and scientific, as it were, although we use, in scientific studies, we certainly use those records to give a clear sense of the history of that period. The Tibetan Plateau, as Sonam Farazi has commented, is the third pole on Earth. Effectively speaking, it is outside the North Pole, outside the Arctic and the Antarctic. It is the largest source of frozen fresh water on Earth. It is, however, the only source of frozen fresh water that is immediately surrounded by half the world's population, and that half the world's population, effectively speaking, depend upon for the consistency of their industry, their agriculture, their cities, their capacity to live to an old age. The requirement of that fresh water, which during the summer months is captured in the cold of the high mountains when the rains come, and trickles down during the dry months to keep those rivers, the Indus, the Tarim, the Mekong, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Brahmaputra and the Yalang Tsangpo, the Indus and the Sutlej, to keep all of these rivers flowing throughout the year, requires that cryosphere, that domain of ice, to exist, and to exist in great abundance. Now, the cryosphere, as all Tibetans will know, consists of three major things. The Ka of Kawa-Chen, the snow. The Kang, the ice, that is the great glaciers, but also the frozen ice underneath the land. Okay, for those of you who are more familiar with in Britain, here we are, we were surrounded by sea. We're familiar with icebergs. Frozen land that freezes for hundreds and thousands of years breaks and separates out into great underground icebergs. There are many places in Tibet where you can go that if you dig for 1 meter or 2 meters under the ground, you will simply come across ice. And that ice is like a huge underground iceberg. And those two are melting, all right? Now, that cryosphere, that cooling is essential to the continued welfare of Asia as a whole, of India, of Nepal, of China, of Bangladesh, of Southeast Asia, of Kyrgyzstan, of Tajikistan. All of those regions around the third pole, around the Tibetan Plateau, depend upon that quality of Kawa-Chen for their livelihood across the year. Now, I will skip past this bit since I'm just at 9 o'clock. I've just explained that. Roughly speaking, just to give you a quick sense of this, anyone knows from their elementary geography, during the year, water evaporates from the sea. And the sea is, by the way, not very good for us. It's not very useful to us. It's full of salt water. We can't drink salt water. If you try it, you'll die within 3 days. Don't try it. If you put it in an engine or a factory, it will destroy the engine and the factory within a matter of hours. If you try to grow crops on it, they won't grow, okay? So that seawater is no good for us, but when it evaporates as a consequence of the sun and travels towards the mountain regions because they are cold, When it arrives at the mountain regions, it falls as ice and snow and rain. And that, if on the Tibetan Plateau, that freezes because it is presently cold. And it keeps that ice for much of the year. It holds back the great rivers from flooding the fields and, knocking away large bits of villages and communities and towns. If it weren't for the Tibetan Plateau, the monsoon would destroy every nearby town. Because the ice and the cold keep much of that precipitation, keep much of that rain up in the mountains. And then, when it's not so rainy, during the dry seasons of the year, it melts to keep those rivers going so that they can be used for the first harvest of the year, for example. So that's your water cycle, and we live within those water cycles. If I use a Buddhist terminology, we are dependent originations, and we depend upon that fresh water to exist. We must live within this, and when it is gone, or when it speeds up, we suffer. Now, that is true of populations all across Asia. Roughly speaking, there are 225 million people that live in the immediate area around the third pole. And those populations are already being affected by the changes that are coming with climate change. They are already being affected by the growing instability of water in those areas, for their yaks, for their goats, for their fields, simply in some cases to travel, or simply to get water that goes into their urban water systems. Around that, beyond that, those rivers feed into systems that for example, the Yellow Basin area, the Yangtze Basin areas, the areas that are in purple on the slide. Those areas contain 1.9 billion people. And they produce food and industry and technology and products, such as my phone here, for example, that go to 4.1 billion people, more than half the world's population. All of that depends on power chain to work. Now, oops, is this going to work? There we go. So, why is the Tibetan Plateau changing? Why is the third pole effectively shifting? Why are the glaciers melting and the permafrost underneath the ground fragmenting? Okay, here we need to be really, really clear. The primary number one major cause is global greenhouse warming. That is a cause by a factor of 10 over everything else. Okay. Second to that is largely South Asian air pollution. Okay. The way the winds flow across Tibet largely come from the west, across the Karakorums, and all across Ngari into eastern Tibet. From eastern Tibet, they carry them into northern China. Okay. Now, much of that sucks air up from India, and there is a very considerable quantity of what scientists refer to as black carbon particulate, and brown cloud pollution. When these land on a glacier, the glaciers quite literally reflect less sunlight, and it's like putting on a black suit on a hot London day. You're going to feel warmer, and your glacier is going to melt. It's as simple as that. None of this is terribly complicated science. It's all within our everyday understanding. So that pollution helps to melt glaciers, okay? But not as much as greenhouse warming, which has, generally speaking, increased the temperature across the Tibetan Plateau significantly. I'll come back to that in a second. The third source, and the lesser still here, but still important in local areas, is deforestation. Deforestation slows down the way the forests slow down water as it moves out of the Tibetan Plateau. Particularly during the 1950s through to the 1980s, there was major deforestation across eastern Tibet in particular. That deforestation pretty much immediately caused significant flooding in the upper Yellow River areas of China. This produces a substantial problem. If you have roots in the soil, it slows water down. It leaves slow water down. Branches, they do these things. So that simple process very quickly affected flooding, particularly in Western China. So, and similarly, a city like this one, I've just come down from Scotland. I live in a small city, it's Aberdeen, there's only 250,000 people in it, much smaller than London. And the temperature difference is dramatic, simply as you enter London by train. A city warms its nearby areas, and if there's a glacier or there's permafrost in that area, it affects all of those things. Now, across the Tibetan Plateau, we have therefore seen, particularly since about the 1980s, a significant increase in temperature. Now, anybody who, I went to Lhasa first when I was in 1986. I was 18 years old at the time. And Tibet has been my life ever since. But certainly the last time I was allowed to go to Tibet, which was 2004, the temperature difference in the springtime was dramatic. And everybody in Lhasa was speaking about it. Similarly, the same is true in places like Ladakh and Zanskar. Everyone notes this significant increase in general, particularly summertime temperature, and the reduction in very cold winter days. Now, just to explain an important point about this diagram, sorry for the technical diagrams. You might notice the line that goes across it. That line is 0 degrees centigrade, okay? That is the point where ice turns to water. And it is a point that when you cross it, change comes much faster. And effectively speaking, the Tibetan Plateau's general temperature has, since the 1980s, kind of moved up above that overall temperature. You can see that it's done so before, and that has certainly occurred for certain periods of time, but never as dramatically as we've seen and never as consistently as we've seen in the last 20 to 40 years. Now, our projections for this in the future, particularly looking at greenhouse gas climate warming for the Tibetan Plateau, give us, roughly speaking, these results. And they depend on our action. And this is important. The future depends upon today. If we keep going the way we are, then the projections are that the Tibetan Plateau will increase to up to 6 degrees centigrade more. Now, that's within this century. What occurs beyond that, we actually simply cannot calculate. We don't know. If we significantly reduce back, it will still increase. So if we go, the terms here are RCP 8.5 is kind of business as usual. It's about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. RCP 4.5 is significant reductions. RCP 1.9 is the Paris Agreement, and that would still lead to a 2 degrees centigrade increase. So even with the Paris Agreement, the Tibetan Plateau will still end up significantly melting. We almost cannot stop this. At this point, it is not, for the Tibetan Plateau, because it is so high, and because global warming has a greater impact the higher you go. For the Tibetan Plateau, the only way to stop this is to significantly reverse greenhouse warming. Not to stay the same, not to increase by only a bit, but we actually really have to take it, roughly speaking, back to the 1960s. Now, there are other impacts that come from that. These are more unstable, and they are, from a scientific perspective, the modeling and the predictions on this are less reliable because they talk about the question of precipitation, the question of the amount of rainfall. However, broadly speaking, there are consistent projections that state that under global warming, the Tibetan Plateau will become wetter, and quite significantly so. Okay, so effectively speaking, if you want the picture, the simple picture for the future is warmer and wetter, largely speaking across the Tibetan Plateau, most substantially in the central and eastern sections of the Tibetan Plateau. Less so in the west, around the Karakoram ranges. The winds there are strong and push inwards, and that has a significant cooling effect. So one of the few areas, for example, where the glaciers aren't going away is in the Karakoram Mountains in the west. It's often referred to in scientific data as the Karakoram anomaly, but we do know why it's happening. Now, all of that means that for the larger section of the third pole region, the cryosphere is going. Now, you know this as far as glaciers are concerned. Oops. Glaciers, largely speaking, across the Tibetan Plateau throughout the 20th century have declined dramatically. Many of them have dissipated. There are an awful lot there. Roughly speaking, as we speak at the moment, there are something on the lines of 5,600 cubic kilometers of glacial ice on the third pole region. They cover something on the lines of 56,000 square miles. And there's a lot left to go. But one of the major projections that there is scientific consensus on is that the majority of them will be gone by the end of this century. Let me be clear about this, since we have some very young people in the audience. That is, by your old age, most of them will be gone. Okay, so that is within the lifetime of people in this room. That significant change will have occurred. Now, we don't know how fast it will occur, and it's possible that that will actually occur faster because there are what are called positive feedback mechanisms. But we know that, roughly speaking, the majority of them will be gone by that point in time. Similarly, the underground permafrost, if none of you have ever seen permafrost because, for example, you're in London or India or Nepal, this is what permafrost looks like in Canada. Permafrost is, like, as I say, an underground iceberg, and just above it is an area called the active layer. And in the active layer, that's the bit that warms during the summer, and it means you can probably grow things there. You can grow grass for your yaks and for your goats. You can, if you're lucky, grow barley and other short root crops. And it's an area where you can achieve things, but if you go deeper, you can have a layer of ice. And those ice layers, in some areas of the world, like Siberia, for example, those ice layers can be up to 1.5 kilometers deep. Now, we don't know actually how deep the permafrost goes across most of the Tibetan Plateau. We do know that it is dissipating, but the precise calculation has only been done for areas that are economically important. So, for example, the railway between Golmud and Lhasa, we know, roughly speaking, exactly how deep the permafrost there is. But for an area like Ngari, for example, it is unknown. These are unknown factors. Now, the permafrost, however, we do know from surface temperature that they are dissipating significantly. So, for example, if we look at permafrost across the Tibetan Plateau in the 1960s, this is roughly speaking what it looked like. The blue areas are where there is good, solid, cold permafrost. The yellow areas are where it is beginning to warm. The red areas are where it is actively melting. This is what it looked like, so that's 1960. This is what it looked like in the year 2000. And since somebody asked yesterday about what it looks like now, I thought I'd go and find out for you from the latest data. This is what it looks like now. So 20 years later, there's still further dissipation. I would hasten to add, it looks less dramatic because it's only basically 10 years since the last results. Now, when permafrost melts, what happens on the Tibetan Plateau? What happens to the life of your relatives, for example, that are still there? Well, we know that permafrost melt has significant impact on the livelihoods of communities across any permafrost area. Roads buckle as the ground underneath them turns to water, to all intents and purposes. Railways wobble so that you can't run a train over them. Buildings like this one here is in Yakutsk in northern Siberia. That entire city is beginning to collapse because it is entirely built on permafrost. Houses crumple. It is estimated that the railway between Golmud and Lhasa has 15 years left before so much of its railway line is compromised that it will be impossible to carry anything. And that's not my estimate, that is the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They're already looking into this problem and tearing their hair out about it. Despite the fact that it was significantly built not to warm the surrounding areas as railways do, the problem is the surrounding area is already warming under global warming. Now, more substantially for local communities, the real problem is that, well, you've seen it earlier on this year. The report has recently come out. You probably saw the Chamoli collapse that destroyed 2 hydroelectric dams in India in February. The scientific report has come out on that. It's an important one to note. It doesn't come from a rainfall or a flash flood or a thunderstorm or extra snow or anything on those lines. It doesn't even come from a glacier melting. It comes from the ground underneath breaking up. Permafrost holds most mountains together. And if you live close to its slopes, as it warms, that permafrost turns from glue to water. And the mountain will slump. And when it does so, the effects of this are, as we've seen in Chamoli, these are enormously powerful events. These are events that no human capacity can actually stop once they've started. The 2 hydroelectric dams that it went through, it took seconds to break through them and to overwhelm them. It was still causing water turbulence 2.5 weeks later, 1,000 kilometers away. So these events, once they start going, it takes a small amount of energy for us to put into the system to create the global warming, but the response we will get from nature is usually much larger. It's a little like kicking a yak. If he kicks you back, you'll know about it. Now, this means that we have seen across the Tibetan Plateau regions consistent mountain slump and valley slump in all of these areas. And this has turned up quite regularly. This is the one, for example, in the Gola Machanrab landslide of 2017. This more recently is the Yalang Sangpo one. The Yalang Sangpo region in particular, particularly around the major bend, is very unstable. What it does is the land subsides into the river. It then fills up. The river is blocked until it gradually wears through, then very, very, very quickly, and you get a flood that heads downstream into India, carrying all of that mud with it. Now, just to give you a sense of how fast this is changing, sorry for the technical ones again, here is a table of river blockages around the same region as this one in the last 60 years. So we have one in 1950 that was caused by an earthquake, one in 1968 that also blocked the river, one in 2014, one in 2017, another one in 2017, another one in 2017, another one in 2017, another one in 2018. And that just takes you to 2018. That just happens to be what was in this published report. The acceleration of these processes of land collapse is occurring across the Tibetan Plateau. And this obviously has significant dangers for any communities that are in the way. The next impact, and I'm sorry this is depressing, but it depresses me as well, by the way. The next impact of this comes from that underground permafrost collapse effect on water. I'm going to quickly skip past here because I'm running out of time. Here's a nice little diagram of water permafrost. If you imagine the light brown area is your permafrost underneath the ground. When it's frozen, ice is waterproof. So if you have a large layer of permafrost underneath the ground, any runoff from rain or snow or from a glacier is going to stay above that permafrost. It will feed grass. It will feed barley. It will feed millet. It will feed peas. It will feed all of those major products, all right? But when you melt it, that water falls away from the surface underneath the ground and goes into the deep, dry ground underneath the permafrost. All right, now this is one of the ones that, for example, this caused the Chinese Academy of Sciences a great intellectual problem because they knew that the glaciers were melting, but they were wondering that the water wasn't coming out of the Yangtze or the Yellow. Where was the water going? So they said, well, there must be some land use problem or something on those lines. But the evidence seems to suggest that what is happening is that the Tibetan Plateau's water is falling into deep earth and gradually filling up. And what that means is that the water is not available at the surface for grass, for barley, for things for yaks to eat. The grasslands turn to desert as a consequence. Not because the water isn't there, but because it is deep. So this turns to this, and eventually this. Desertification across the Tibetan Plateau, and you can see these in the orange areas, has proliferated over the last 30 years. What's interesting, however, and this is the interesting point, is that that process is slowing down. And in fact, in certain areas, it is reversing as the water gradually comes back up again. So many of the areas, particularly in central, in places like Ngari, for example, around Namtso, places like that, will kind of turn to marsh. Okay, in time, but it is a lot of time. Now, if I was going to say that there was one nice story to this, to all of this horribleness, is that while the next 100 years are catastrophic for many communities in the Tibetan Plateau under climate change perspective, if we look beyond that, we've seen that the Tibetan Plateau is getting warmer, it's getting wetter, and water is accumulating. One thing we know is the ice will be gone. It will not be Kawachen anymore. Be a little closer to looking like Scotland, actually. But we also know that much of it will become more fertile. We know already that some trees in certain areas are growing faster. But that is a major transformation whose effects on the wider Asian area are actually no kind of good. The wider Asian area beyond the Tibetan Plateau will ultimately turn to desert. Rivers may well become entirely seasonal, which means they won't be able to support cities or factories or agriculture. On the Tibetan Plateau, ultimately, if we're talking 150 years in the future, the speculated suggestion at this point in time is that the Tibetan Plateau will ultimately become one of the more fertile places in Asia. And I'll leave it at that.
To this forum, and it was made all the more interesting because of the multidisciplinary perspective you gave, not just as a climate scientist, but someone who has known the Tibetans well, the Tibetan history and Tibetan religion, it sounds like. It's always interesting to listen to you. I now open the floor for questions from the audience here, or if my colleagues could let me know if there are any questions from people online. Okay, Ugenla. And I would request you to stand up and speak loudly because people watching online can't hear the questions from the audience. Sorry, and because of social distancing, we can't give you a mic. Sorry about that.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And we used to think Tibet, especially around Lhasa, was under the sea once upon a time, yeah? Mm-hmm. Do you think that sea has turned into a thermal past? And yeah, so
Okay, it's a really interesting question. Geologically speaking, that is, of course, entirely correct. The Tibetan Plateau was created 50 million years ago, roughly speaking. Once upon a time, India, the Indian subcontinent, actually was connected to Australia. And at some point, they had a bit of a divorce, and India packed her bags and headed north to see her friends in Eurasia. And about 50 million years ago, the Indian subcontinent hit southern Asia with enormous force. And just like a carpet rumples when you push it against the wall, the Tibetan Plateau was raised up out of the seabed. Now, we actually know this because there are fish fossils very close to the top of Everest. In fact, famously, although I believe a little apocryphally, I've yet to find it out, but famously, Mallory, when he first attempted his climb of Everest, found a fossil of a fish quite high up, and he put it in his pocket and climbed a little further. But because he was getting high altitude sickness, he tried to get some chocolate out of his pocket, picked out the fossil, took a bite, broke his tooth, and threw it away. So that, I don't know whether or not that story is true, but we do know that the Tibetan Plateau was raised out of the seabed, and that is why many of the lakes, such as Namtso, for example, are salt lakes. That is why Tibet actually had a goodly industry in producing salt that would be sent down to places like India and China and so forth, way up until the early 20th century. And in fact, I think they still do it in certain areas of Ladakh, for example. So yes, the permafrost, that's an interesting question. That's a good question. Does the permafrost come from that? It doesn't have to. And I don't know the answer to your question. So I'm going to go and find that out because it's a really interesting question. But I do want to say one thing because it's something I forgot to add to the talk. And it's important for any of you that, for example, have relatives and so forth in Tibet. One of the consequences that permafrost specialists talk about is that when that water, if the permafrost melts, when that water goes down, it goes into the deep earth. Now, when the Tibetan Plateau was created, it rumpled like a carpet, and it broke up and revealed large quantities of minerals, all right? So if you look across the Tibetan Plateau, the reason, the Chinese word for Tibet is Xizang, and that means the Western storehouse, because Tibet has gold and uranium and rare earth metals and copper and molybdenum and barium and a whole range of things like that. It's got oil and gas and everything. And all of that, a lot of that is by the surface. Now, the problem is this. If water to reach a river goes deep into the earth, it goes through all of those heavy metals, which means your river goes from being nice and clear to suddenly having some pretty nasty stuff like cadmium and molybdenum in it. And that is a significant concern, and particularly things like cadmium, which is a significant poison. You don't want to drink cadmium in your water, you'll get stomach cancer reasonably quickly. But certainly heavy metals like those are turning up increasingly in the waters that are coming off Tibet. And one of the major reasons for that, a lot of people have quite correctly talked about mining as a source of that. And yes, that is true. Mining is generally terrible for local water supplies and awful for local crops and terrible for local populations. But we are also seeing a pattern where deep earth minerals are coming through into rivers as a consequence of this drop of water. So there are a lot of processes, but with reference to your specific question, I don't know the answer, but I will find out because it's a really good question.
Thank you, Ungela, for raising that interesting question for Martin. Now he's got more job to do now. I will ask this question from somebody who's come online yesterday and today as well. Somebody who looks very keen and seems to be following Dr. Martin Mill's speech with much interest. So the question is from Luang Po Tho. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. The question is, will Thailand no longer be able to sustain 3 or 4 rice crops a year within the next 20 years as our rivers start in Tibet?
Sorry, can you tell me what the second word was there? Will
Thailand no longer be able to sustain 3 or 4 rice crops a year within the next 20 years as our rivers start in Tibet, as the rivers come from Tibet downstream to Thailand?
Okay, this would be a question I would, if for real expertise, I would pass to my colleague, Michael Buckley. The answer to that question, of course, is very specific for the southeast of Asia, and it depends on dams, all right? One of the things that everyone has pointed to and turns up quite regularly is the question that China in particular, but India and a variety of Pakistan, Nepal, roughly speaking, everybody that's anywhere near the Tibetan Plateau, have spotted the problem of the water cycle that I have referred to a long time ago, all right? And sought to a certain extent to do 2 things. The first is to slow the water cycle down by putting dams in place, all right? So effectively speaking, water doesn't move as quickly by having a dam there, and you seek some degree of control. One of the major areas of damming here are on rivers such as the Mekong and the Irrawaddy and the Salween. And all of those are very, very significant dams because the drop is really serious. And therefore they can produce hydroelectric power very significantly and everything on those lines. Now, there are problems to this, which is, for example, that a dam will stop sediment moving down a river. In other words, a river, as it moves towards something like a delta area, to grow crops around it, you actually, it's a balance. You need some chemicals to be brought down to provide fertility for the land. And a dam will often stop those sediments from moving down, which means you don't have a replenishing supply for a delta area, which you do in areas such as across large areas of Southeast Asia. So from a simple kind of global warming perspective, it's very difficult to make a calculation because dams are actually significantly affecting water flow in those areas. So this is the area where we move into geopolitics, and the geopolitics particularly of dams and water security and everything on those lines. I mean, the obvious answer to this question, therefore, is will the problems that generated these dams in the first place and get worse? And the answer to that is obviously yes. How much worse that is does depend on human control of those water resources. I mean, I talked yesterday about the problems associated with dams. Dams are a very problematic area when you're dealing with forces as large as are those available in the Himalayan region. The Himalayan region and the Tibetan Plateau is one of the most geologically unstable places on Earth. India is still trying to get into Asia. It's still pushing north. And that makes the Tibetan Plateau very vulnerable to landslides, to earthquakes, to all of these things. If you add global warming to that, that actually accelerates that process because the Earth is no longer as stable as it was. It can't hold together as well. So in answer to your question, that depends very significantly on human factors, which are beyond my ken. I can't answer that. The people you want to talk to are the people in charge of the dams.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience here? Okay, again, Jayala first. I'll come to you later.
My question to Martin is this. Yes, we are aware of all the problems due to the changes in the environment. And we know that you have just spent always a detailed account of how it affects Tibet. And also it affects the rest of Asia. And also affects, they say that there's a link between the recent heat waves in Europe to the loss of glaciers in Tibet. And also the warmer winters in Canada to the loss of glaciers in Tibet. So how can we internationally, our Tibetan voice will be very weak. Internationally, how can we put pressure on China to stop this happening?
Martin, if I can take another question and then you can answer both of them together. Kungala.
My question is two-part. First one is did you come across China, of course, doing loads of study about the Tibetan Plateau? Have they done an analysis of what will be the economic impact? How big will be the economic impact if that things happen? The worst things in 60 years, 50 years, how much is the impact? And the second part is, it was good to know, to a certain extent, when you said the railway line has got 10, 15 years and it will buckle, good to know that there will be a less Chinese transferring into the central Tibet. But then, of course, our concern is to stop that happening. What China is doing in Tibet in terms of stopping that, I know they are building more cities and nomadic peoples are forced into a city life and so on. The nomadic life should be helping keeping it cool. So what sort of programs are there China doing in Tibet to stop that? Have you got anything come across?
Yeah, we can talk about that, certainly. Yes, the Chinese are intimately aware of all of these matters, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences spends a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money looking at these issues. And there are, I would hasten to add, there is not one Chinese position on this. There is, there's a scientific position, there's a policy position, there is a national position with reference to environmental issues, there are local provincial issues with reference to economic growth, and all of those are tensions and they exist in transition to one another. I mean, I do need to make a point here, and I hope I don't offend, given the audience. But Tibet is more than the Tibetan cause. And its impact on the world is more than that. And the two can't be brought into full link with one another, okay? Nature has no respect for borders or boundaries or political sovereignty. It does not care who owns a bit of land, because the land does not change by being owned. It doesn't turn blue or get heavier or anything on those lines. This issue is an issue which, I mean, certainly we can say something straightforward, like the major point the major scientific consensus is the primary driver here is global warming. That word is important, global. Now, the largest contributor to greenhouse gases on the planet is the People's Republic of China at, roughly speaking, 28% of carbon dioxide production. America is 15%, but if you went back to the 70s, those numbers would have flipped over. So much of the damage was previously, for example, done by America. Some of it, the pollution that was previously a terrible cause of a whole range of environmental issues, and the dominant one was, for example, northern China, has shifted to India. I think it is important to understand that what surrounds the Tibetan Plateau are larger issues about global economy. I have an iPhone. That iPhone was made in China, okay? And it was made with, even the microchip in it, tiny little thing, takes 800 liters, 0.8 of a ton of water to turn fresh water into polluted water. Each of us, I don't know how many iPhones there are in the room, or how many Galaxies or Samsungs or Huawei's or anything on those are in this room, but we all do this. We are all part of this puzzle. And I think it is really, really important that we, and I'm sorry to put it this way because it sounds like a criticism, but it really isn't. It's just so vital to say this. One of the biggest breaks, speaking personally, having looked at this issue for years, one of the biggest breaks, one of the biggest obstacles, barche if you want in Tibetan, one of the biggest obstacles to climate change really effectively happening and being organized properly is the political blame game that causes those who are doing it to kind of run away from the accusations. We actually have to move beyond this because in the end of the day, this is really a problem about biology and chemistry and physics. Sorry to be scientific about it, but it is. Most of what I've talked to you about today, these are simple physical processes. And if we simply go down the road of saying, whose fault is it? We know that that will simply not progress towards a solution. We have to get beyond that. Okay? Now, the Tibetan issue and the third pole issue is one of the most advanced issues on climate change in the world. And we are learning most of the lessons. And we're learning them really fresh. Okay? You know, as I said yesterday, when the Chinese said, oh, desertification is happening, it must be the nomads. We're going to move 90,000 nomads, separate them from their flocks, move them out of an area the size of France. They were simply following any development manual that was available in the 1980s. That's what any development manual would have told them to do. It was wrong because it didn't take into account climate change. We're learning anew all the time about these, particularly when those issues come together in ways that are profoundly unexpected. You can't sit there and say someone should have known better because no one knew better until 2 or 3 years ago. When I write these reports, even since January, some of the science has developed. So I would sort of say this is really important. If you want to get somewhere on this one, we all do need to work together. And I get it, you know, I get the politics of this. But our grandchildren will not care about our politics. They will just blame them for us for it. We have to look very, very clearly at this problem. So I appreciate many of the issues here, but you know, the dominant driver here is global greenhouse warming. That is not about who, that is about how we do things. Because we all do them. We all do them. Everybody in this room, China, the UK, America, all of these things. It's about how we produce energy. It's about how we organize land. And all of those things are ones that are shared across the global economy and are contributing to this problem. So while I'm really sympathetic to this question, you know, when it comes to this question about Tibet, Tibet is larger than the Tibetan Plateau, than the Tibetan cause, and will outlast the Tibetan cause. It will still be there, a little warmer, in 1,000, in 1,000,000 years' time. That place will still be there. Those mountains, most of them will still be there, okay? And even the Tibetan cause is larger than the argument between, for example, Dharamsala and Beijing. It is about larger questions than that. The future has to be. And I know that's a disagreement, and I'm speaking out of turn, and I'm just a gozer, you know. But I've given most of my life to this, and I've worked as hard as I possibly can, and that is my honest appraisal.
Thank you. Thank you very much for working hard for Tibet and giving us a real good perspective of how the climate change on the Tibetan Plateau is a global issue. I will now invite our second speaker, Joanna Walton, at Tibet House, under the leadership of Mr. Sonam Frazi, we want to work in collaboration with other civil society organizations, especially on environmental issues. As we know, it's a global issue and the effect is global. So we are very pleased that we have Jo here with us today. She is the Director of Communications at Ashton Climate Solutions in Action. Jo has also overseen the smooth delivery of 15 Ashton Award ceremony right here in this hall for ceremonies with speakers including the former US Vice President Al Gore, Sir David Attenborough, and Ashton's patron, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. Jo will tell us about the work of her organization and her own inspirations on getting into the climate action movement. Jo.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Tibet House and to you all for inviting me here today. It's a brilliant opportunity. And it is very unusual for me to be sitting on the stage because I'm normally running around in the back at this venue, making sure everything runs smoothly. I thought I'd start by telling you why I'm here. I've been working in the environment sector for a very long time, about the same time that Martin was discovering Tibet in the 1980s. I was trekking around India and Southeast Asia, and I found myself in Borneo. And it's an amazing island full of incredible plants, landscapes, and animals. But I took a bus across the island and we drove through beautiful rainforests full of huge moths and flying lizards and amazing animals. It was beautiful. And then the bus came to an area of land where all of the rainforest had been cut down. The land was devastated. It was just horrendous to see. There was big machinery there and all the trees were gone. And then we went to an orangutan sanctuary. And the reason that there's an orangutan sanctuary is that we had cut down their home. It was awful, and it stuck with me. I came back to London after another year's traveling, went into a conventional job, but I couldn't get those images out of my mind, and I felt that I had to do something about it. So in my own small way, I've dedicated my career to working for environmental charities. And the last 16 of those years has been at Ashton. So I'm going to tell you now, we've heard some rather depressing facts from Martin. I'm going to try and lift the spirits a bit before we all go off for lunch and talk to you about some of the solutions and what you, sitting in this room, and what you online can do to play your part. As Martin said, we are all in this together. We're all responsible and we can all make a difference. Of course, it's up to the big government infrastructure to really change stuff, but there's lots that we can do on the ground as well. And that's what we do at Ashton. So we find brilliant people doing amazing things and we tell their stories. So here we go. We're going to watch a little film, hopefully, about one of our winners.
ನನ್ನ ಹೆಸರು ನಾಗೇಂದ್ರ ಅಂತ. ನಾನು ಗುಂಬಳ್ಳಿಯಿಂದನೇ ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದನೇ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ನಾನು ಈ PSಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಡ್ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ರೇಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದೆ. ಕರುಣಾ ಟ್ರಸ್ಟು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಸೇವೆ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಇಂಡಿವಿಜುವಲ್ ಜನಗಳಿಗೆ ಸೇವೆಯನ್ನು ನಾವು ಟ್ರಸ್ಟ್ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಈ ಒಂದು ಆಸ್ಪತ್ರೆಗೆ ಬರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಎಲ್ಲ ರೋಗಿ ಉಚಿತವಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಸೌಲಭ್ಯನ ಟ್ರೀಟ್ಮೆಂಟನ್ನು ನಾವು ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಮತ್ತು ಇದು ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಹತ್ತಿರ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಸರ್ಕಾರದಿಂದ ಅವ್ರ ಹತ್ರ ಬರೋಕ್ಕೆ ಆಸ್ಪತ್ರೆಗೆ ಬರೋಕ್ಕೆ ಈಸಿ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಮತ್ತು ನಾವು ರೆಗ್ಯುಲರಾಗಿ ಫಾಲೋ ಅಪ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಈ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾಥಮಿಕ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ರಕ್ಷಾ ಸಮಿತಿ ಅಂತ ಗುಂಬಳ್ಳಿ ಒಂದು ಕಮಿಟಿ ಇದೆ. ಈ ಕಮಿಟಿಯು ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಕೆಲಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಪರಿಶೀಲಿಸಿ ಇದು ನಿರ್ವಹಣಾ ವೆಚ್ಚನ ಅದನ್ನು ಭರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಈ ಪ್ರಾಥಮಿಕ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರಗಳಿಗೆ ಕರುಣಾ ಟ್ರಸ್ಟ್ ಹೆಚ್ಚುವರೆಗೆ ಏನು ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಈ ಪ್ರಾಥಮಿಕ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಟೈಮ್ಸ್ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಪವರ್ ಗ್ರಿಡ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಆಗಬಾರ್ದು, ಜನಗಳು ತೊಂದರೆ ಆಗಬಾರ್ದು, ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನು ಸೋಲಾರ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಉಪಯೋಗಿಸಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಈಗ ಈ ಕೇಂದ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ಸೋಲಾರ್ ಅಳವಡಿಸೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಪೇಷಂಟ್ಗಳು ಯಾರೂ ಕಾಯುವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಆಟೋಕ್ಲೇವ್ ಮಿಷಿನ್ ಆಗಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ಆಗಲಿ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ವರ್ಕ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಪೇಷಂಟ್ಗಳು ಸರಾಗಿ ಬಂದು ತೋರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ಯಾರು ವೆಯ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ರೀತಿ ಕ್ಲೀನಾಗಿ ತೋರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಇದು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ಹೊಸ ಬಿಲ್ಡಿಂಗ್, ಅತಿ ಶೀಘ್ರದಲ್ಲೇ ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನು ಇನಾಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಾಥಮಿಕ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಸಮಗ್ರವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಚಿಕಿತ್ಸೆಯನ್ನು ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ, ಇದನ್ನು ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರಾಥಮಿಕ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬಂದು ನೋಡಿ ಇದನ್ನು ಅವರ PSCಗಳಲ್ಲೂ ಇದನ್ನು ಉತ್ತಮವಾಗಿ ಸರಳವಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಅಳವಡಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ರೋಗಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಉತ್ತಮ ಚಿಕಿತ್ಸೆ ನೀಡಬೇಕಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ.
So these are the awards that we're going to be making later this year, hopefully during the COP conference in November. And I thought I'd show you that just as an example of how the sort of organisations that we're working with and rewarding are bringing energy to people who need it in a sustainable way. So they're not contributing to carbon emissions, but increasing people's access to reliable energy, which helps with their health and other things. I'm not going to talk to you anymore about that. I'm going to talk to you now about something which I hope will be really interesting, particularly to the younger members of the audience, which is our work with schools. So we've had a few winners from UK schools over the last 15 years, and they're a very inspiring community. Schools that are working on sustainable energy and behaviours are full of really amazing people who are really inspiring and have inspired us to create this campaign. So what we wanted to do was encourage schools to do their bit to get the UK and hopefully eventually beyond to our net zero carbon targets by 2030. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. But before I do that, I'm going to show you another film. And this is one of my favourite films. It's about one of the schools that won an award a few years ago. And it stars a marvellous young man called Tommy. And in the office, our nickname for him is Tommy the Tooth. And you're about to find out why. Do I need to click it again? Oh. There we go.
Hi, my name is Tommy and this is my school. My school is not that big. There are 4 classrooms and 103 children. The teachers are teaching us to save energy. Our eco-ambassadors, Charlie, Aaron and Paige, save energy by making sure the classroom lights are off. In the toilets there are light sensors, so when we go in, the lights turn on, and when we go out, the lights turn off. We've got plastic curtain doors in our classrooms to stop the heat from escaping.
This is the electricity meter. This shows us how much electricity we are using, and this chart shows us how much electricity we are saving.
We changed the lunch time to a bit earlier because the trolley was wasting electricity by heating up the food. My tooth's out. I think I swallowed it.
The sun comes in, so we don't have to use the lights.
We've got recycling bins too. We found it! easy for the schools to follow our lead and do the same. Anyone can do it, it's just a flick of a switch. I'm gripping my tooth tightly.
I love Tommy, he's great. He always cheers me up. I love his positive attitude and the brilliant work that he and his fellow classmates are doing at their school. So I'm just going to ask, those of you here who are currently at school, how many of your schools have an eco club? Do you know? Nobody. Right, well, that means after today, you could have an action, which is to go back to your school and say, let's start an eco club. And I'm going to give you some ideas of the sort of thing that you could be doing at school to help your school become more sustainable. And we're going to look at, very quickly, I'm going to whiz through it because I know we're running over a bit, energy, travel, buying stuff, food, and using your voice. So we'll start off with energy. In the film, Tommy talked about turning off the lights. We can all do that. We can turn off lights when we're not using them. We can turn off TVs, computers, whether we're at home or at school. We can do our bit by turning off the lights. So we like to say the most powerful tool you have for climate action is your finger. Use it to switch things off. And as I said, that's your computer at home. It might be the telly or the Xbox. And don't be afraid to ask your parents or the teachers to do their bit and turn things off as well. When I was growing up, my dad used to walk into the room and go, why are the lights on? It's like Blackpool illuminations in here. Turn them off. Maybe you could do that to the adults if you see them not turning off the lights. The other thing you could do is put some signs around so people know when it's okay to switch things off, because sometimes people are a bit scared. They're not sure. They might get into trouble. So maybe you could go around your school and just put some little signs saying it's okay to switch me off if I'm not being used, so that you know that you won't get into trouble for doing it. I'm a bit worried about time. Are we? Yeah, okay.
Still have about 20 minutes.
Okay, fine. All right. But I'm not going to show the next film that I was going to show. On our website, there's lots of film resources that you can use to find out more. I'm going to show you one, but I'm going to skip this one that's coming up. Does anybody here have a smart meter in their house? Yeah? Great. Do you know how to use it? Do you ever look at it? It's one of your tools in your becoming a climate change champion. Have a look at it when you get home. Have a look at what it's showing. Put the kettle on and see what happens to your smart meter when you put the kettle on, because I can bet you it'll go shooting up. By looking at that, you can have a look and think about what is using energy in your house and challenge yourself to get your energy use down. And I'm sure your dad would be happy as well, because it cut his electricity bills down a bit. They're being rolled out across the UK, so eventually you will all have one. The next thing we're going to talk about is travel. So, how do you all get to school? How many people here go to school in a car? How many people here get to school on a bike? Nobody. How many get to school on their feet? Oh, that's good. Lots of people using their feet. Brilliant. Glad to see that. The average journey for a primary school student in the UK is just over a mile. And for secondary schools, it's 3.5 miles. And nearly half the houses in the country have got school-aged children in them. So that's over 9 million children travelling to school at the same time every day. And all of you know that if you get in your car just between sort of 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, or at 3:30 in the afternoon, the traffic is a lot worse. And a lot of that is people driving their kids to school. So how about you think about a different way to get to school? Could you cycle it? Could you get on the bus if it's too far to cycle or to walk? This is something that you can do, and if you walk or cycle, not only are you cutting down on the traffic, you're going to help air pollution. It's a big problem, and it's been shown that in cities like London, air pollution around schools is particularly high at those times. So by walking or cycling, you could do your bit to help cut that down, which will make it nicer for everybody. Next, buying stuff. We all do it. Martin was talking about the fact that we've all got one of these, we all wear lots of these, and we live in a consumer society where we are encouraged to buy lots of stuff. But when you buy something, maybe have a little bit of a think about where did it come from? What resources were needed to make it? So when it comes to an iPhone or your clothes, there's lots of water goes into making those, lots of energy, and somebody's time and labour. And if you just buy a really cheap T-shirt, £3, wear it a couple of times, think, oh, it only cost me £3, I'll throw it away. Think of the waste that is. Far better to buy things less often or to buy things that are second-hand, that have been pre-loved. Think about that sort of circular economy. And now is a great time to do it because we're coming out of lockdown, and lots of people use lockdown to have a jolly good clear out, empty their cupboards, get rid of lots of stuff. So if you go to the charity shops right now, they'll be full of amazing bargains that you can use to kit yourself out, buy some books, whatever it is that you fancy, but doing your bit for the environment whilst you do it. That also applies to food. So we are going to come on to that now. Here is a picture of a cow. Production of food contributes to about a third of our carbon emissions. This is affected by what we eat and where it comes from. And there's a reason for this picture of cows. And this is the reason. So there are 1.4 billion cows on the planet. Each of them are burping and farting about 250 to 500 litres of methane every day, which is nearly 40% of methane emissions globally. That's an awful lot. And methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we really need to do something about it. The other thing about eating lots of meat is that it's actually a really inefficient way to feed yourself. So you feed the cow some grain or soya or grass, and then you eat the cow. Far more efficient to just eat the grain or soya or whatever that you were feeding the cow. So we're not saying stop eating meat, but we're saying maybe eat it less frequently. And when you do, be mindful about where the meat came from, how it was produced, both in terms of animal welfare, but also just thinking about the intensity of the farming and the impact that that had on the environment. I am going to show you this next film because I really like it. So this is related to the cows, and this is about, basically, it's about cow poo. Do I need to click?
Across the world, biogas provides a fantastic source of clean fuel for cooking, lighting, and electricity. It is produced by breaking down organic matter like animal dung, leftover food, or even human waste.
One problem that was bothering us when we came here, how would we dispose of our waste? And when we got this, in fact, it came as a blessing. No smell, no mess.
Inside a large tank, bacteria convert wet organic waste into methane gas. And each day, the tank must be fed with waste mixed with water. The rest happens naturally. The bacteria reproduce and keep the process going. Finally, the methane gas is piped to where it is needed, for cooking or lighting. For rural families, the manure from 2 to 4 cows, or 5 to 10 pigs, can produce enough gas for all household cooking needs, and sometimes for lighting too. A family, or even a whole community, can replace a lot of its cooking fuel using just its own food waste. The gas created by waste from one market's fish stalls generates enough electricity to run 20 electric lights for 6 hours. gas and inefficient stoves contributes to indoor air pollution, which kills more than 4 million people across the world each year. But biogas is a great alternative. It burns with a very clean flame. It's easy to control and cuts indoor air pollution to safe levels.
Clean, without any smell, and completely burnt. No much carbon, no smoke. It's a beautiful system.
There are other advantages too. Collecting manure and feeding it to a biogas plant is much less time-consuming than gathering wood and preparing a cooking fire. Biogas replaces wood, and so reduces deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions. The plants that use animal dung and human sewage also improve hygiene and sanitation.
Before we had the biogas plant, there was a terrific stench, very dirty and smelly.
If that wasn't enough, residue from dung-based biogas plants makes a fantastic fertilizer that can dramatically increase a farmer's yield. And that's why biogas is brilliant.
Initially, I was using commercial gas for cooking. I was also using charcoal and firewood. They were all very expensive. Now that I have the cows, I decided to use the dung. I've used it for over 1 year, and since then, I've never used any other fuel.
For more information about Ashton and our winners, visit ashton.org.
Another one of my favourite films. I love it, and I love biogas. It's just such a brilliant solution, completely circular. I do enjoy that one. So, as I said, a bit less meat, a bit more vegetables. I know we don't always like to eat our veg, but they are delicious if they're cooked the right way, and can really make a big difference to your health and the planet's health. And maybe your school's got a bit of space. You could get them to let you have a go at growing some veg at school, or at home in your garden, or even on your windowsill. You can still grow some herbs, or maybe a tomato plant. We can all have a go at growing our own food. The last thing I was going to talk about was this, using your voice. Now, have you all heard of Greta Thunberg? Do we all know about Greta? Yeah. And her Fridays for the Future, striking for the climate. And she really inspired a lot of young people to use their voice to call for action on climate change, and quite rightly. It's you who are going to be deeply impacted by this, and we have to step up and do something to try and stop it. You could join a climate strike or a demonstration if you wanted. There are other things you can do as well. You can use your voice. This is Matilda, and she noticed that when her parents' newspaper arrived on a Saturday morning, the magazine that it came with it was wrapped in plastic. She had to think about that, and she thought, oh gosh, this is happening in every home around the country. It's this ridiculous waste of plastic. So she wrote to the newspaper and she said, can you stop this, please? And they listened to her, and they changed it, and they changed to compostable bags. And then a whole load of other newspapers and magazines copied The Guardian, and changed to using more sustainable ways of packaging their magazines. So her one action, writing a letter, created a big ripple of change. And each one of you has the power to do that. If you see something that you don't think is right and should be changed, you can do that by using your voice and the power of your pen. The other thing that you can do is get your school to have a look at signing up to the Let's Go Zero campaign. As was mentioned earlier, this is London Climate Action Week, starts today. There are events all this week about climate action, and there are a couple of events being run by us about the Let's Go Zero campaign. Tuesday next week is the School Summit Day, so there's going to be lots and lots of events online about what schools can do around climate action, and we'll be running a couple of sessions about Let's Go Zero. The idea behind the campaign is that, as I said, is to get every school in the UK to sign up their commitment to help the drive towards becoming net zero by 2030. Now, we want the leaders of schools to be the ones that sign up, but you, as parents, as pupils, maybe you're a governor, can help us achieve this by talking to your school about what they're doing, by suggesting that they have a look at the Let's Go Zero campaign, and also Transform Our World, which is one of our partners on the campaign. They've got loads of materials online, which will give you lots of ideas, some of which I've talked through now, but lots of hints and tips and suggestions of how you can all play your part to help us tackle climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. That was very empowering. You've given us lots of tips on things that we can do as an individual to make a difference, as well as letting us know the strength of our voice in advocating for things around us, and also to your organization for putting the spotlight on the communities and people at the front line of climate change. I would now give the floor for some questions. Maybe the younger children here, if you have any questions. Is that you, Verdin? Okay, that's very good. Could you stand up and speak loudly? Thank you.
What is your favorite animal that you have seen in Asia?
What is your favorite animal that you have seen in Asia? Is that right?
Yeah. I have to say my heart was stolen by those orangutans all those years ago. They are the most extraordinary animals. I don't know whether you've ever seen one, but they are gentle and they have a kind of wisdom around them. The sanctuary that I went to was taking in orphaned, so it's taking in baby orangutans who were such fun. We watched them playing and putting buckets on their heads and larking about, and they're just like children. And they bring them up there, and then they rehabilitate them back into the wild. And we trekked into the rainforest and stood and listened, and we heard this crashing through the canopy of the trees. And a mother orangutan came swinging through the trees with her baby under her arm, and she came because she knew there was a feeding platform there where they put fruit out to help the ones that were going back into the wild. And it was just magical, and that's why I do this job, because I want to protect all those amazing animals that we are so lucky to share our planet with.
Thank you. Any other questions, children? I can see, I think, is that a raised hand or? No? Okay, yes, the lady at the back. Could you come a little bit to the front and, sorry, and we need to keep our questions short now.
I really appreciated some of the suggestions that you made just now. And I also feel like, individually it makes you have more purpose when you think about, what exactly you're doing on a day-to-day basis. But then I started to think, when you look at, like I know sort of some people have already mentioned during other questions, you start to think individually, am I actually making a difference when there are bigger picture, items happening in the world? And you start to think, should I actually be sacrificing? Like, for instance, I used to be a heavy meat eater. I produce stuff, and I'm realising the impact I'm having on the planet. But to some extent, I sometimes feel like, should I be making certain sacrifices so that everyone's not playing their part, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to sort of get your feedback on.
Okay. The question was, should I be making sacrifices when everyone else around me doesn't seem to be doing so? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, all right. And there is another burning question from our panel, Dr. Martin Mills. Oh, okay, you want to answer to that one. Okay, that's nice.
Well, I mean, I feel your pain, and actually it's the governments and the big corporates that have got the power to make the really deep systematic changes that we need. But in order for them to be pushed to do that, we have to play our part, which is why the last bit I said about using your voice is probably the most important part. It's important that we all learn behaviours, and particularly with our children, that they learn or they unlearn our bad behaviours, if you like. The generation that's grown up since the war in this country has grown up and been trained to be profligate consumers, and we need to untrain ourselves from that. But at the same time, I believe the place where you can really make a difference is by telling the people in power, so the politicians and the people running our corporations, that you don't want it to be like this, and that you won't continue to buy their stuff if they don't change, and you won't continue to vote for them if they won't change. And the other place you can make a really big difference is with your money. So if you have a pension scheme or investments, don't have it invested in fossil fuel companies. Send a message through the power of each one of you. Will have a little bit of money invested somewhere, change it, because that's the sort of thing that they listen to. Martin?
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer. I'll try to make a quick answer. I think this is an assessment that particularly adults can do for themselves. 25 years ago, I spent, as part of my doctoral work, I spent several months, many months of a particular year in the 1990s living in a Tibetan monastery in a little village about 10 days' walk from the nearest road. I depended upon 19 people who worked very hard on the fields and everything on those lines, 4 streams and 6 fields, okay? During lockdown, I was bored one day and had a day off, and I did a calculation, and I tried to calculate all of the places that my food came from for the 3 meals of the day, the laptop I was using, and the other things that I used during that day. And I ran through the chains that were required to produce the plastic, the water, the electricity to produce the plastic, to process the water, to all of those things. I had a bit of a OCD day as far as that was concerned. I discovered that to simply get me through 3 meals and the Google checks that I required to do that, if I visited each of those places once a day, it would take me 3 lifetimes to visit them all. That's what our economies do for each of us in comparison with an economy in a rural area where there's no electricity but people are living full lives. That is the difference that is made in all of our consuming lives. So I would encourage people who are kind of adults to actually do this, because it gives you a sense of how much more we use this earth in the present economy than, for example, Tibetans living out in a village normally did to live full lives. So I think we, as individuals, we do actually have an enormous impact, and we can do that. We can just think about how rational our lives actually are, because a lot of the time we are blind to those enormous dependencies, the enormous amount of transport, the enormous amount of electricity, everything that is used simply to put a pot noodle, or God forbid, or any other similar subject, or even this thing on our tables. We have an economy that just does that, and it does do it for each of us as an individual. And we need to actually, one of the things here is we need to think about that and really grasp the sheer magnitude of the change that has occurred in the last 200 years to our lifestyles as individuals that has actually presented us with the problems that we're facing.
There's a really good book by Mike Berners-Lee called How Bad Are Bananas? And it literally gives you the carbon footprint of anything you might want to eat. So I recommend going to your library or charity shop and seeing if they've got a copy of that. How bad are bananas? And it literally, you can find out. And it will tell you, actually eating a banana is not as bad as eating a punnet of blueberries from Chile, because banana comes on a boat and the blueberries will come on a plane. So it gives you those kind of comparisons and really helps you make those decisions. So at least you can feel better yourself about the decisions that you're making. And we are all in this together, and we are all responsible.
Did Sunoma wanted to say something? Oh, okay. I think we're running slightly short. Maybe during the last session workshop, maybe we'll have more questions. So did Martin say like 3 lifetimes to produce 3 meals a day?
The laptop took up a lot of it.
Okay.
You'd be amazed.
So, that's, wow, 3 lifetimes.
If you visit each place that's required, plus the electricity, plus the water, plus all of the water filtration plants, everything that makes your personal life possible as you live it today, from the face mask you are wearing to the clothes. If you just run through just one day, you will find that this thing will accelerate massively. And for me, it was 2.5 to 3 lifetimes.
So I think with that, we will conclude the first session of the day. Sorry about the timing. I think if I don't stop now, the catering people won't be too happy with me. Lunches from 1 to 2. So thank you very much to our speakers today. That was really helpful. I think Dr. Martin Mills gave us a very good perspective of the issues involved with the climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. And Joe gave us some very good tips about the things that we can do to make a difference. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I couldn't take all the questions. Maybe you could save it for our last session, the interactive session, when we will be more than happy to hear from you. So thank you. I need to get the mic closer. So we will start the afternoon session of today. The first speaker today, this afternoon, is Tile Chuki. Tile Chugila is the Special Appointee for Human Rights at the Tibet Bureau, Geneva. The Tibet Office, Geneva, has the special responsibility of Tibetan advocacy work at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Tile Chugila, are you ready to join online? Yeah, you're here. Go on.
Yes. 토마딜리아 테리 표범망부 직폐요레 송소 아니 창말올리아 참디데시레 슈기 Tine tari injimi kashe lesha song song di indogalia chazanchiga inget holia shunayaga do song song ani ingenalia shuchoche. A very good afternoon to all the participants today. Today is the day I really wish I was there in person to discuss the topic. It would be a continuation of what was discussed yesterday. So yesterday I focused on what are the avenues available at the UN and how advocacy generally works out, and also on different aspects about working inside the UN and how we can try to bring forward the environmental issues in juxtaposition with the human rights issues at the UN Human Rights Council. So today I have been asked to speak on how in general the advocacy works, and also try to talk it vis-a-vis the UN Human Rights Council. So as sort of a continuation to yesterday, I just thought that I would want to take the case of Anya Centrala continuously. So if there are people who were not present yesterday, I would just want to give a very brief introduction to his case. So Anya Centra is a Tibetan nomad, an environmentalist, an anti-corruption crusader who was from Amdo region, and he was around 47 years old when he was arrested and detained on 4th September 2018. And while in detention, he was tortured, and he was not even allowed to meet his lawyer. And he was detained for 14 months before a very swift and shady trial in 2019. And after the trial, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He filed an appeal, but the appeal was rejected. So in connection with the case, I discussed about the various avenues that were available, which special rapporteurs would be triggered, and where all we could go and advocate his case. So today, specifically on advocacy, as I said yesterday, when we ask what advocacy is, generally the definition is advocacy is an activity by an individual or group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social institutions. Whereas when I contextualize it to the environmental issues and to Tibetans, advocacy would be ensuring that the voices of Tibetans who are oppressed and whose environmental rights are being violated are amplified at every table that matters. So when I say advocacy, the first and foremost thing would be to identify these three important parts of advocacy. Firstly, it would be the voices of the Tibetans. Second, amplification. And third, every table that matters, right? So you dissect the way advocacy works. To begin with, when we talk about the voices of the Tibetans, it is very pertinent that if you are advocating for the Tibetans' rights, it's very important that you know what is happening in Tibet and what is happening to Tibetans and how their rights are violated. So when we say voices of Tibetans, it's very important to identify what are the key issues that Tibetans are struggling, how are they oppressed, and what are the environmental issues that are happening in Tibet that would need the attention of the global audience. So that would be the first and foremost thing that any advocacy event or any advocate who wants to work for Tibetans would want to do. Secondly, amplification. So when we say amplification, we are basically amplifying the voices of the Tibetans. And it would be very important under the amplification to understand which areas and how to amplify, right? Where to amplify and how to amplify. And then the third composition of an advocacy would be which are the tables that matter. So when somebody asks me, I'm an advocacy and how you would want to define the role of an advocate, I would generally jokingly say that advocates or people who are involved in advocacy are basically very similar to chefs who take all the raw materials that is provided and ensure that the clients, in a restaurant, the client who comes to eat the food will have a very specific demand, and therefore we create the messages, the raw material in a way that a very beautiful dish is served to the client. So I think when I put it to an advocate or a person who's involved in advocacy, it's very important that we get these important voices, these oppressive issues that are there, and put it in the table that matters, but in a way that is very relevant, to the person who is listening to it, because for them it is like an issue that is happening way far, in sometimes at the other corner of the world, and they feel that, okay, it's happening somewhere there, but it's not very relevant to us. So therefore, when we talk about Tibet, it's very important that we kind of make it relevant to the person whom we are approaching. So again, when we talk about advocacy, it's very important that we have an idea about who are the audience. So when we talk about the audience, it's basically you divide the audience into two major categories. The first would be the primary audience, and the second would be the secondary audience, or the additional audience that we are targeting. So the primary audience, let me use the case of Anyak Sengtra. In his case, when we are amplifying his voice or his situation, obviously the first and the primary audience would be the UN, the special rapporteurs, the civil society organizations which are involved in these, in analyzing the human rights situation, and of course the permanent missions. So before you begin any advocacy work, please ensure that you know who are your primary audience. Is it the British government? Even within British government, which department is it? Is it the Home Department? Is it the Foreign Affairs Department? Depending upon your issue. So if it is the Olympics that you're dealing with, of course, there would be an Olympic contact person in London or any capital, the capital of any country. If not, then of course, if there are any sports ministry, so you look at who are going to be your primary audience. And then, of course, you have to decide how you're going to reach out to them. Generally, in the case of primary audience, it would be a one-on-one meeting, a briefing meeting, or submission of a petition. So that is very important to understand how you're going to reach out to your primary audience. In the case of Anyak Sengtra that I took, our primary audience, as I said, were the UN special rapporteurs, the civil society organizations, and the permanent missions. So what we did was we sat together and decided that how we are going to approach these people. And with regard to the special rapporteurs, we sent out petitions, we sent out reports of his arrest and how he is being tortured, so on and so forth. With regard to the UN, we raised, UN as in like the entire Human Rights Council session, we raised his case during our oral statement. So we got an opportunity to present the case at the UN Human Rights Council. So during our oral statement, we raised his case. And also with regard to the permanent missions, throughout our advocacy work, which generally starts almost a month before the session starts. So we started reaching out to all the permanent missions. So when I say permanent missions, it's basically representative of one country. So when it comes to the UN, every country sends a permanent representative at the UN. So the two major headquarters for the UN are Geneva and New York, and both these cities have permanent missions which have permanent representatives of each country. So we reached out to the usual usual permanent representatives with whom we have very strong contacts. So we reached out to them, we requested for a one-on-one meeting, we prepared briefing notes, we spoke to them, and after the meeting, we handed them the entire briefing note and all his case. So this is very important when we talk about one-on-one meetings. It is very important that you carry a briefing note and you are very prepared about what you're going to say there. The most important components of the briefing note would be, one, why you're meeting them, the major issue. And then second would be what you're asking from them, so your major asks, right? And then you can, of course, include a detailed note on the entire case. And also for the UN, it would be like, what are the opportunities where they can raise this case, right? So for us, the Angyak Sendra case, when we went to the permanent missions, we spoke to them. Our briefing note included what his case is. And then our ask was that, can you please raise this issue at the UN Human Rights Council? And then we also provided them opportunities where this case could be raised. For example, there was the item number 4, which generally discusses all the human rights issues across the world. And, then we also identified certain reports of the special rapporteurs, like there was a report, I think, on the special rapporteur on torture and so on and so forth. So it's very important when you go for a meeting, on advocacy meeting, to have these 3 important components in your briefing notes. I would like to once again repeat. The first one would be why you're meeting. Second, what your asks are, and third, where are the opportunities that you see the person can intervene, do the job that you're asking him or her to do. So that would be one of the important things. And then, of course, if the person is involved in a specific decision-making position, then, submitting a written petition. And when we generally talk about any advocacy work, one of the most important thing that we think about is, protest, or going on the streets and raising the voices, which is very important. I totally, say I would totally agree with people who say that this is an important activism work to be done. But there are also behind the scenes that you can do, and therefore, those are the things that I'm highlighting today. Then secondly, it would be on how do you reach out to the secondary audience, right? So you have the primary audience, which are generally the decision makers or who have the direct contact to do certain things that you are asking them to do. The secondary audience would be, the media outlets or the general public or international organizations that are working on similar issues, but maybe they do not have a direct relevance or contact with the specific case, or they do not have any decision-making power immediately. So with those, how do you interact? I think the best way to interact with them would be, organizing conferences like these, where you are reaching out to the general public and you're asking the general public to go ahead and file the petitions, or you reach out to the primary audience. So basically, when you look at the secondary audience are generally the people who will go and interact with the primary audience, like your primary audience, right? So for us, the secondary audience was again the general public, and then the international organizations and media. So one of the best ways, as I said, would be conference or organizing certain events. So we organized a virtual side event for the issue of Angyak Sendra and other human rights issues. And then, of course, publishing of reports, which would be again picked up by the media, and then, of course, giving the media the copies of the petitions that you have filed. And then the major important tool that has now come up is the social media, of course. So there are many ways that you can interact in the social media. I think discussing about social media would take a lot of time, but I would just want to put out there that there are many major social media that we are using. So Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat sometimes. or LinkedIn, so on and so forth. So if you are an organization, if you're an NGO, please ensure that you have a presence in all these social media platforms, and you try to amplify. So the best way when we talk about social media and how to use the social media would be, of course, many people go live on social media and just discuss about what the issues are and how they are trying to bring out changes. The second would be making very short videos of less than 1 minute. It's very sad, but the span of our attention has gradually decreased for so long that now we are saying that please make only 1 minute video or 2 minutes video or sometimes even 30 seconds video. So that would be one of the ways. And also pictures. Pictures are one of the most important ways that you can bring that shock value to the people that you're trying to reach. So please use those most important categories of social media. So when it came to making it relevant to the case of Anyak Sendra, we held a side event. It was virtual because of the pandemic. So we discussed how torture is being used or how Tibetans are being arbitrarily detained, so on and so forth. And also we tried to submit as many reports as possible to the special rapporteurs, to the media houses, to the international organizations. And we tried to make those news reports available at our social media accounts as well. And then within the social media, again, the publicization of his case and then sharing the reports that we have filed. So just trying to make that relevant. I hope it's understanding for you to. I hope that you're able to catch up on what I'm saying. Another thing when it comes to advocacy would be to identify your partners and your stakeholders or your collaborators. This is very, very important. So as a Tibetan, I would say that we already have many collaborators and partners who are, whom we can reach very easily. The first one would be the Tibetan NGOs. Right. So when you are organizing an event, it's very important that you find collaborators or you find partners and who will in turn help you reach out to the secondary audience and the primary audience. So in the case of Anyak Sendra, what we did was that we, reached out to Tibetan NGOs. That is, for us, it was the Swiss Tibetan Friendship Association. It was the Tibetan community of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and all the Tibetan communities within our jurisdiction. And of course, and then the Tibetan Women's Association, Tibetan Youth Association, so on. So we had already made a very strong list of who our partners are. And it's also very important that you kind of have a periodic interaction with these partners so that you don't go to them immediately, out of the blue, and then start asking them to collaborate. It would be very helpful if you have almost a periodic sort of interaction with them. And then, of course, we have the TSGs, the Tibet support groups. So these Tibet support groups are very, very important. I've always said that had it not been for the Tibet support groups, which are predominantly, involving non-Tibetans who have non-Tibetans as their members, for the continuation of, amplification of Tibetan voices in Western world, because had it not been for them, many non-Tibetans wouldn't have listened to what the plight of the Tibetans are, because this is very crucial to remember and to understand that if I am going as a Tibetan and meeting an MP or say a person who is in a decision-making position, of course the person will welcome me and listen to me and everything, but that person wouldn't know exactly how much to trust me, right? So it is always important that you collaborate with the TSGs have predominantly non-Tibetan members, so that when the decision maker looks around, he realizes that, my own people are also supporting the Tibetan cause. And therefore, of course, there must be merit in what they're saying. And this is, I mean, it's sometimes sad, but it's also very basic human nature that you would listen to your own people more than somebody who's a stranger. So this is a very important link that we have, and therefore it's important that we nourish that link, we nurture that link, and we ensure that it goes from strength to strength. So for Tibetans, when we talk about the collaborators, of course, as I said, the Tibetan NGOs, and secondly, it would be the Tibetan support groups. And this is a very, very crucial link that we have. Now, for example, whenever we lobby, whenever we do advocacy meetings, one of the most important TSG in Switzerland that we rely on is the Swiss Tibetan Friendship Association. And say in Czech Republic, there are a few, one of them is Czech Supports Tibet, so on and so forth. So it becomes much easier when you partner with them, because at the end of the day, your entire intention is that the voice of the Tibetans inside Tibet gets amplified. So using those resources that are already readily available to us. And then, of course, religious centers, if it deals with issues like the enforced disappearance of Panchen Lama, right? It's been 26 years since his enforced disappearance. He was barely 6 years old when he was kidnapped along with his parents and family members. And till date, we do not know what has happened to him. So on the 25th year of his enforced disappearance last year, we reached out to the religious centers as well and asked them, could you please highlight his cases, because he is a religious leader. We generally do not reach out on political issues to the religious centers, because we would definitely want them to have that liberty of, not feeling pressurized. But if there are issues related to the religious leaders, definitely, the religious centers have a stake in it, because the extent of persecution of the Tibetan Buddhists in Tibet is mind-boggling. We have seen the destruction of the Larungar and Yachingar Buddhist Center. We have seen how Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns were evicted, and it led even to a few of nuns committing suicide, which is very, very sad. But that is the thing. So when there are religious issues involved, definitely collaborating with the religious centers would be a good option. So these are just an examples of how I would want you to think when you are planning any advocacy meet or any advocacy work. In addition to that, whenever you go on protest, which basically shows the extent of people who are really committed to the issue and are ready to come out in the public and speak in the public and demonstrate in the public. So whenever you do those, public events of demonstrations or protest march, please ensure that you reach out to the media before itself. You have a very strong case, and ensure that you have a ready petition to be submitted at the culmination of the protest, because at the end of the day, you have to bring all these, working elements and ensure that it culminates at one end. So having a written petition to be submitted at the end of the protest march, or at the beginning of the protest march, whatever is the right order of work, that would be very, very important. So if you are involved in advocacy, please be very ready to pull up your socks. You might be called on to design pamphlets. You might be called on to just in 2 minutes, at 2 minutes notice, you just have to get there and speak. You should be ready to draft petitions. You should be, so it's basically a multitasking work. So reading reports and speaking, and in between, so many 100 things that you can do and that you should do. So that I just wanted to give a very, very brief overview. I so very wish I was there in person so that we could have done a few activities. I'm not able to see any of you. I'm just seeing my own face in the laptop, which is a little uncomfortable. But at the end of my presentation, I would request all the Tibetan youth that are present here, and of course all the non-Tibetans also that you're present here, please do not give up. There will be times where you will feel hopeless, where you will feel that, oh, there's no way to go, right? But always remember that every person who is working on Tibet and Tibet-related issues, there are hundreds and thousands of Tibetans who are depending on you in Tibet to amplify their voices. I have been involved in activism since I was 13-year-old. There were instances where people would ask, I've seen you doing this every year, what's the point? And more often than not, I would feel very discouraged. But I always remembered that I am not doing it for my sake, or I'm not doing it for the sake of the people who are in India. I'm doing it for the people who are counting on us in Tibet to amplify their voices, to ensure that there is a degree of freedom that they can enjoy. And I just wanted to share a very personal note of how I came about working at the CTA, because I think it's very important that at this age and time, it's important to find sources of motivation. And I hope sharing a few stories of me would encourage you to think broader. I was working in the corporate world. I was heading a legal department for Tata Motors in India. And I still remember as if it was just yesterday, on 29th of February in 2016, I just walked to the office. I still remember it was a very long pathway to where my desk is. So I walked there, I opened my laptop, I finished my email work, and then I was just checking my Facebook page, and then I saw this news about a 16-year-old Tibetan boy. I'm sorry, I'm giving you, a trigger alert. It was a 16-year-old boy, Dorjit Singh, who committed self-immolation in Dehradun. And it just hit me. Until then, I was thinking that, I was participating in activities. I was going there translating. I was participating in protest march and everything. And throughout my childhood, I was brought up with the notion that the reason why I'm studying, that the reason for my education is to ensure that I will be able to help Tibetans. So I thought I was doing enough, right? I was participating in all the important demonstrations. I was there. I was helping out Tibetans. But that day, when I saw the news of the 16-year-old Tibetan boy who had not even started his life, self-immolating, it just hit me. Maybe I thought that the reason that he decided to self-immolate was that he thought, we are not doing enough, that there was this need for urgency. And that's when it hit me that, I cannot be complacent and think that I'm doing enough. There is not enough when it comes to Tibet and Tibet-related issues. Whatever you do is just a drop in the ocean, that you could have done so many more things. And that's when I decided, I need to get out of the business laws. And then I did my second LLM. And then I started working directly at the CTA, because I thought, this is one of the institutions through which I can have some direct impact on the ground. So I'm just sharing this personal story for you to know that whatever you think you're doing, I'm sure you're doing a great job, and I'm thankful. I'm very, very grateful that you are doing it. Your very presence at this conference, giving up your holiday and coming here, you're doing a lot of work. But please also remember that if you think you're doing enough, it's not. There are so many more things that you can do. So please do not give up. Do not give up. that's all that I can say. Do not give up. We have a long way to go, and we have much more to achieve. And hopefully, and I sincerely hope that before within His Holiness's lifetime, we will be able to go back to Tibet, or at least there will be some degree of freedom. That's all from my end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tilela, for sharing your experience and the experience of your office in raising the Tibet issue at the United Nations. I think you have given us a template and tools for advocacy at our end here, and your talk will inform the strategy that we would have to build to take the Tibet issue to the COP26. So thank you very much. I'm now going to open the floor for questions from the audience here. Before that, I have some announcements. We have been able to put a mic there in the center. I have strict instructions to let you know that you need to stand in the spot where it's marked and not to touch the mic. Thank you. So the first question, I'm sorry, okay, sorry. Go on, did I see too many hands? Okay. Kungala first, and then I will ask the gentleman there. Kungala, if you could come to the...
Hello, Tirela Tujichena, and that was a very good talk. Can I ask you about how do you measure your success or the progress, maybe like tiny little successes you get along when you do the advocacy? How do you measure it, and how do you know once you have submitted your petition what is happening behind the doors? Whether there is just put a pile, its petition there, or is there any progress going on? Do you have to have somebody you know, or do they let you know what is the progress? And finally, how do you adapt your advocacy as you go along? If there is no improvement at all, if there is a slight improvement, or if it's now almost we are hitting there, so how do you adapt your advocacy along the way? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kungala, for that kind words and the question. So when we talk about advocacy, generally we don't start advocacy with a very broad goal. Every advocacy generally will have a very specific goal. For example, if you ask me how I measure the success of the advocacy that we have done, for us, when the special rapporteurs sent a joint letter to China on Anyak Sendra. So 5 special rapporteurs came together and sent a joint letter of allegation to China on Anyak Sendra. So that was, a measure of success for us, because what we had hoped for was, of course, like we had hoped for a very, very much, like knowing that, having a session at the UN or UN coming out with a special rapporteur and so on and so forth. But for this very specific task, just having that letter of allegation or communication sent to China was our measure of success. So every advocacy, you will have a set of goals, and it's also very important to know what your goals are. So, for example, some advocacy works are just to ensure that the Tibet continues to be discussed in the media, or just to ensure that there is some discussion in the media about Tibet, or like, for example, the climate conference that we have. Maybe one of the goal would be to ensure that the media picks up this issue and starts discussing. So once you have those media discussing, you could just make it as a scale for your measurement for your success. So knowing what you want from the advocacy work would be, again, one of the most important things to measure your own success. And your second question was, how do we follow up? of course, I think it's very, very important to know that you need to follow up on whatever petitions that you have sent. So generally what we do is we send out an email. However, we might have, submitted the petition. If we had submitted the petition in person, whoever we had submitted, we would note down their name and their email ID. And then, maybe after 2 weeks or a month, we would send a reminder and ask, can you please let us know what is the status of the petition that we have sent? We have also had very strong success when it comes to the petitions that we have sent. We've always received replies telling us very specifically that this was done, or we tried this, but we could not do this, or a general acknowledgement saying that this is what we have received from you, and we are trying to do those things. So again, as you said, having a contact point would be very crucial to ensuring that you have a regular follow-up on your petition. As an example, with regard to the Panchen Lama, 25th year of his enforced disappearance, we reached out to all the 193 permanent missions in Geneva. We sent them the petition, and most of those countries responded as saying that, yes, we acknowledge, we are trying to ensure that the freedom is restored, or he is released, or so on and so forth. We also had joint statements. So in our petition, we had specifically requested for joint statements. So they gave joint statements. We had statement from Germany, from Switzerland. We had statement from parliamentarians. So again, following up with the petition or whatever your advocacy goals have been, and noting that these goals have been measured and what was not measured. And one of the most important aspects, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this before, is after every advocacy campaign, it's very important to have a debriefing session with your own team. So after every campaign that we have done so far, we always sit together and discuss, we did this did not work, maybe we should try this next time. So we always make either mental note or a physical note of saying that this we tried, and this did not work. This worked very well, so we should continue what worked, and we should adapt what did not work. So debriefing session after every advocacy work is very, very important.
Okay, thank you, Jalila. And the gentleman there, yeah. And I forgot one important instruction. We got to keep the mask on while you're speaking here, because it will be used by all other people as well. So if you would come here and stand near the mic, the floor is marked where you need to stand. Or perhaps you're exempted from mask? Yes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. And if you could say your name as well.
Oh, yeah, okay. Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Sagar. So my roots are in India. So I've got an environmental question because I'm an expert. I fully understand supply chains. And when I look at supply chains, people look at a product in the UK, for example, they define it as green, but a lot of the times they don't comprehend, or they don't even look at where the product is actually coming from. And I was just looking at the Tibetan, mineral mining in Tibet, because we're here about Tibet. And I found that huge amounts of lithium, which is required for these solar panels. And I know the issues with the solar panels, and it's going to be green. My question is that people have this notion that renewables are fossil fuel free and they're sustainable. And I want to do good for Tibet. I want to contribute to the people. I'm not from that region, but I've just got an affection for the Tibetan people. But at the same time, I'm going to be buying or investing in a renewable product, which is probably being contravening the people in Tibet's lives in some way, shape, or form. So you're talking about how to address the NGOs or the government bodies. My challenge would be how to actually not just challenge the government bodies, but how to actually correct the miseducation which is there to the people of Tibet and around the world, and actually saying, you funded this solar panel, it's actually done the opposite. It's not helped the people in Tibet. It's actually taken their rivers away. And how do we correct that miseducation and actually saying that, do you want the soil to grow the food in Tibet? Or do you want to dig up the forests and the minerals for your solar panels? And how do we correct that miseducation? Because it's the same everywhere. But considering we're talking about Tibet and the atrocious issue that is there for human rights, women's rights, whatever it is in Tibet, in India, most of the slaves working in these mines are women and girls. And I imagine maybe it's the same issue in Tibet. But how do we address that and correct this miseducation? Because there is this notion that renewables are fossil fuel free, they are good for the environment. But it's quite evident that when you look at a lithium mine, it looks like a meteorite has hit that land. And it's just like a massive crater. And from experts I speak who are soil experts, they say, you're talking about 200 years to get that soil back. And this is very fundamental, whether it's Hindu philosophy, Jain philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. We've got 5,000 years plus of indigenous knowledge, which is of Tibetan medicine, which is of all these cultures. But how can we actually respect our cultures when we've taken away the dharti? We've taken away the soil, which is the very essence of God in nature. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, please, and how to actually change the narrative and challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sagar, for that very important question. And I'm very happy to see a fellow Indian. As His Holiness always says, we are Tibetans, but we are nourished by the dal rotis of India. And wherever I go, I always feel sometimes more Indian than Tibetan. But yeah, so thank you so much for attending the conference, first of all, and giving your precious time and connecting with the Tibetan issues. With regard to the supply chain, of course, one of the major issues that the Xinjiang case has brought up to the forefront is the supply chain issue. It was always discussed with regard to Tibet, but it was not as prominently, and of course, the international media did not pick it up that strongly as they have done with the Xinjiang case and the forced labor camps there, and how every iPhone that you use is basically done by the forced labor of the Uyghurs. So definitely supply chain, one of the major issues, and how do we change the narrative? I think one of the cases that I came across in Switzerland was that in Xinjiang, and of course in Tibet as well, there is this company called Hikvision, which manufactures cameras, surveillance cameras, which are, basically surveilling the Tibetans and the Uyghurs in the concentration camps, right? So what this civil society did was it filed a case against UBS Bank. It is one of the most important banks in Switzerland. And you might say, how is UBS Bank connected with the Hikvision, that company that is a Chinese company? So it was revealed that the UBS Bank is investing in one of the subsidiaries, which is basically investing in Hikvision. So this company was benefiting from the investments of UBS Bank. And UBS Bank being one of the corporates, it is under the guidelines of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, Cooperation and Development. So OECD guidelines are very, very clear on ensuring that human rights are respected, that the UN guidelines on human rights and business and human rights are respected and adhered to. And there is, the significance of corporate social responsibility that needs to be carried out, and due diligence needs to be carried out before every investment, right? So this Society for Threatened People was the organization, filed a case with the national contact point of the OECD in Switzerland against UBS. So now UBS and Society for Threatened People are sitting together and negotiating, and it's basically a mediation structure whereby the company is saying that yes, henceforth we will ensure that so and so human rights due diligence are carried out. So this is just one of the methods whereby you can bring the corporates that are investing in these companies to task. I think that's more important, because most of the companies that are involved in these, long supply chain do not feel that they will ever be held accountable. But because these companies are headquartered in the Western free world, they have to adhere to certain guidelines, and making sure that you know how these supply chains are involved and which company is involved in which stage of the supply chain, I think that will make them responsible in ensuring that whatever materials that they are selling and profiting from are sourced ethically and are, compliant with the human rights guidelines. I think that would be one of the starting points. And for an individual, of course, please, as I said, use those tools, the social media platforms to inform people, to inform and awaken people about the extent of mining that is happening in Tibet, as you rightly said, and also see if you can question your government, right? Yesterday in my presentation, I said that everything, the world has changed because somebody questioned. So please start questioning the government. You can write to your own government and ask, can you tell me or can you guarantee me saying that this renewable source of energy that you are propagating or that you are campaigning for is actually ethically sourced? And I think that would be a very strong starting point to, start that discussion. And it's very important to know that when you question the government and when the government gives you an answer, it stays in the system. It stays in the record. It is documented. So those documents are, again, very important if you in future want to take any action. And because I'm from a law background, I would say any legal action, right? So documenting is very important. Thank you.
I wasn't talking about a camera. I wasn't talking about your camera or my iPhone. I was talking about the wind turbines, the solar panels, and the electric cars, which have blood of Africans, Indians, and Tibets all over it, and they are sold to us as saving the planet. So how do people feel about that fallacy? That we are funding another asbestos issue. We are funding the slavery of my fellow Indians or Tibetans or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, and it is then dressed up as a green solution for net zero. Forests across India, and I'm sure Tibet as well, are completely deforested. The soil is removed, the dharti is removed, the mines are removed, and then we are saying we're going to plant some trees here because it's net zero. In the accounting principles, they are not. This is common sense. Why are you mining a whole forest over here, selling it net zero here, and then you want to give £5 to some Tibetan charity fund over there?
Yes,
because you've completely stolen their resources and you've sold it as a complete fallacy. So this is what needs to be addressed, please. Thank you.
No, I think you brought up a very, ethical question that I think is not easy to find answers to, but it's something for all of us to think about on a day-to-day level. So thank you very much for raising that, and I think we're running over time now. Tilela, thank you very much for coming on the second day as well. It's nice to see you. I think we have a slight change in program. Our next speaker, Aliza, is stuck somewhere in traffic and between traffic and parking, finding a parking space. So we will go on to the next session if the technical team is ready.
Thank you.
Thank you, Talila. So this is what I would have started with for the workshop. So I'll just touch a bit of that, the beginning part where we wanted to look at the goals of COP26. Okay, so in the morning I talked about looking at the 4 goals of the UK government's presidency for COP26, and we have mitigation, adaptation, finance, and climate change. Oh, great. So I can see my friend here. Hi, Elisa. Please come on stage. You came right in time, so I think I don't have to. We will leave that for now. I'll come back to the COP26. So please welcome Elisa Ayaz, our motivational speaker today. Thank you very much. I'm sorry you had lots of trouble. This is the thing about living in London, I think. Elisa Ayaz is the world's youngest United Nations Goodwill Ambassador. She is the Youth Ambassador for Sustainable Development Goal 13, that's climate action. She has achieved much at a young age, which I find really inspirational. She founded the UCL Climate Action Society, which went on to garner the UK Parliament Declaration of a Climate Emergency. She served as the Vice President at UCL Pakistan Society and UCL Business Society, all the while studying and scoring a first-class distinction in her bachelor's. I don't know how you do that. And she's also a strong advocate on other social and ethical issues. I've been following you. She is someone who will not let anything stop her way. So to Elisa, I'm sorry, I didn't even give you time to breathe properly.
Of course. Thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I think without any doubt I can say it's so important to have events like these, conferences like these, where you invite people from across the spectrum, all kinds of stakeholders, whether you're an average citizen, a student, a professional, an expert, and I'm so glad to see all of you here today. What I want to talk about today is something that is obviously very close to my heart, and something that we should all prioritize slowly but surely. Climate change, we've all heard this phrase. The truth is that no institution across the world can solve this urgent issue alone. No organization, no matter how big or how small, can afford to sit on the sidelines. All of us have to solve it together. In order to tackle climate change, we need to achieve carbon neutrality as organizations, as individuals, as corporations, and as nation states. The aim, I think, is to send a very powerful signal across the world that we as individuals or we as nation states are firmly committed to achieving carbon neutrality. And that alone has the power to unleash potential and innovation like a scale never seen before. And I'm talking about all kinds of solutions, all kinds of targets. The targets we are setting are obviously really bold. But by empowering ourselves, by empowering students, our future engineers, bankers, scientists, lawyers, the private sector, we're all coming together to be strong. We're coming together to fight against climate change. Let me talk about the Climate Action Society, which is where my journey started. I didn't really know what climate action meant, or whether it just was simply a monochrome picture of either I divest from fossil fuels or I don't divest from fossil fuels. And studying about it, doing a lot of research, I realized that it's a whole spectrum of climate action efforts, and there's so many different ways that I can start to be a part of that journey. I still struggle to this day. I'm United Nations Goodwill Ambassador, but I struggle in my daily life choices. Am I getting public transport? Am I getting the car? What am I wearing? Is it eco-friendly? We're taking small steps, but we'll get there. Think about the impact that you have. Try to calculate your carbon footprint. The bigger the carbon footprint, the bigger the responsibility, and the bigger the platform. At the Climate Action Society, we are an entirely student-run organization. And that means we don't really have a budget. A lot of our members are too young to vote. They don't have any positions of formal authority, and we don't have any influence over global markets. But what we do have is a voice and a will to make it heard. And that's what applies to every single one of you here, and as well as me. And as soon as I started believing that, that's what led me to believe that, actually, you know what, I need to do something. I need to be an example for those around me. And I need to make myself believe that if I take these steps, if I start this organization, if I start doing these workshops, these events, if I keep pushing for the things I believe in, I will get somewhere. And of course, I never dreamt that I would be recognized by the United Nations and given such a big responsibility to lead, focusing on the UN Sustainable Development Goal 13. But it has to happen, and I'm glad that more and more corporations and politicians are realizing that we, the youth, are very much part of that equation. When it comes to Tibet, there is no definitive plan. There is, however, a series of recommendations that we can discuss that we need to ponder about. And the first thing is investing immediately in reducing energy demand through support for advancement of energy conservation programs. And I think focusing in this area is going to unleash so much potential. The second area that I think we should focus on is making some one-stage preliminary investments in transitioning to a low-carbon campus, a low-carbon organization, a low-carbon institution, or a low-carbon nation-state. And that could be a fashion industry or a transport system. The third thing, very basic, but again, very important, set specific goals, set specific KPIs, and explore options about external funding. Because the truth is, we need funding to get anywhere. And if that means crowdfunding, then so be it. Number 4, pursuing energy solutions, and this should be in partnership with local and regional entities. I know there's a lot of conflict states across the world, a lot of vulnerable regions which are full of political chaos. And so the question arises, who are their partners in those times of plight? And I think there are people around the world, whether it's NGOs or it's the United Nations itself, that we need to bring attention to. As a UN Goodwill Ambassador, it is one of my priorities to bring attention to those areas and individuals who want to make something happen but are not able to do so because they simply lack the resources. So I think what's happening in the world is that all of us are coming up with different solutions, but they're in silos, they're individual. How do we bring them together and actually make sure that it's a uniform form of sustainable solution? Not only are we aiming for sustainable climate action, but a sustainable, tangible, practical plan. Number 5, let's look at our buildings. We need to adapt rigorous building energy standards and actually look at project approvals in terms of retrofits. We need to look at deferred maintenance system projects that actually lead to a lot of methane leakage, for example, a lot of carbon emissions. And so this brings me to my last and final point. We need to prioritize the development of infrastructure to support a kind of nation state that is a fleet of clean energy vehicles, and replacing the existing fleet accordingly. And when I say fleet, I don't just mean our vehicles, but actually us as well, because we're very much part of the economic workforce that drives how urban development occurs across the next few years. I think we're all watching the North Pole melt. We're watching the Great Barrier Reef die. And it is clearly our responsibility. We are informed and angry about what's happening. We need to step up or we step aside. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, and thank you for rushing through here. I really appreciate that. I'll open the floor to any questions. Okay, Sagar. if you could follow the same procedure and keep your questions short and brief.
Hi, my name's Sagar. Climate change, net zero. Whether it's Jharkhand or whether it's Balochistan and Pakistan, whole forests are removed for the lithium, the cobalt, the bauxite. People are assassinated. There was that lady assassinated in Lahore a few years ago. I went to a seminar on that. They were just campaigning. They didn't know what, even she didn't know what she was campaigning for because she didn't know the resources are being stolen and mined from Pakistan to make wind turbines, solar panels, and electric cars over here. So my question is this narrative that we are transitioning to net zero by completely deforesting someone else's land, stealing their water, their livelihoods, the women are raped, the people are stolen of everything, so I can have a solar panel in the UK. How does that make sense? Because even to get that mine functioning, renewables are not fossil fuel free. I've studied for 10 years. You need the coal to make the plastic, cement, and steel to power the electricity, to power the mine, to power the diesel cars. This is not considered in the accounting principles, and unfortunately, us people from the ethnic minority backgrounds are doing ourselves a disservice by not speaking the truth. When are we actually going to expose this scandalous scam that renewables are fossil fuel free and clean when they are a human and environmental rights abuse? And also, when will the United Nations be held to account for the peacekeepers who have done sexual abuse to women in Haiti and Africa? They need to be trialed in The Hague. But this whole thing is scandalous. And we're just going here thinking we're going to respect our indigenous rights and everything. No. The United Nations, WHO, put them in the dock, not on the pedestal.
We do need to hold international organizations to just as much of an accountable system as we would for any other person or any other criminal. And I think the United Nations is far from perfect. We have a lot of loopholes going around, a lot of controversies, and I actually appreciate that you brought in attention to the peacekeeping programs that have actually, been blamed for and reported for sexual harassment. Evidence has been given, and it is true that these peacekeepers that we trust our lives with, these peacekeepers that we're funding them and their livelihoods are actually just going and ruining someone else's life. So how can we sit content with that? And how is it that we've got women campaigning hard across Southeast Asia to install solar panels in the US or in the UK? And really, there's some kind of disparity. So there's lots of issues that speak to behavioral change, a lot of issues that speak to ethnic minorities, a lot of issues about the issues regarding being a female. It's a fact proven by research that females across Southeast Asia are going to be most impacted by climate change, not just by health effects, but their physical health. And yet, to what extent are their voices actually heard as part of any climate action solutions? They're really not. And how can we actually think about installing solar panels and moving to a very innovative form of sustainable progress in developing nations when you've got issues like rape and poverty and hunger to deal with? These societal issues that are very much ingrained in our heads and we are bound to ignore in societies like Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. It is a sad reality. And as much as we want to get down on the floor and go into the nitty-gritties of holding every person accountable, it is inevitable that we will face these challenges, and I'm not saying we're going to settle for them. In fact, we should campaign for them harder and harder. And this is why we need people like you to publicize this and actually bring attention to these scams and these scandals. I very much had a lot of hesitancy when getting involved with any campaign, with any brand, with any corporation in the United Kingdom. The truth is, I am sat here in a very comfortable position in the United Kingdom when I could be living a very hard life in Pakistan. And, I could not have access to any climate action resources. Thinking about going for sustainable options, sustainable clothing, sustainable transport is just not viable when I've got to worry about other things. So it is a privilege. Campaigning for these things is a privilege. And very much, I think, I, as an individual, and we all as individuals, have to come together to shed light on the inadequacies of United Nations, of WHO, or any other corporate for that matter. And I think there's some serious disparity happening in every nation state. But let's continue shedding light on these, let's continue fighting for these, and let's have hope. We know who is at fault, we know who is to blame, but we simply can't play that blame game. We need to take action, and that means thinking about those individual responsible actions and holding those political organizations. And if that means public-private sector partnerships, then let's think about those moving forward.
Thank you, Elisa. And Dr. Martin Mills, if you could take the...
Thank you. Very simple question about carbon neutrality. Do you think carbon neutrality will save the populations of Pakistan from the water depletion which is occurring at the present temperature and at the present carbon dioxide concentration? Is carbon neutrality, in your view and in the UN's view, even vaguely sufficient to the problems we are actually facing now, which are actually going to continue just at the present temperatures?
The other day I was doing an Instagram question and answer session. I was actually engaging with, what people were thinking when it comes to climate change. And one of the questions I received was, do you actually think that even if we were to achieve all of our climate action goals, all of our sustainable development goals by 2050, the human race could actually survive? And that made me think, we're focusing a lot of attention on saying by 2030 we need to obtain all of these 17 sustainable development goals, and then, we're good to go. Are we really? Is carbon neutrality alone the answer? The truth is, no, it's not. It's not going to save the entire human race. A lot of us are going to suffer, but a lot of us are also going to survive. And which part of the human population is going to be lucky enough, privileged enough to survive? Which segments are unlucky enough to not actually be part of the solution? I think we know the obvious answers, those that are not in places where resources are inaccessible, in places where populations are not represented, even the average citizen, like Pakistan, like India, like Bangladesh, they will suffer. In Thar, for example, which is about 100 kilometers away from Karachi, which is one of the biggest cities in Pakistan in the south, you've got hundreds of villages sprouted across, and they genuinely don't have any water supply. They're relying on groundwater well supply, which runs out every 2 days, and that's it. They've just built around a diet and a water intake, which means that they're surviving across minimum levels, minimum thresholds to survive. And as soon as the temperatures increase above 43 degrees Celsius, they are on the verge of death. I think carbon neutrality is very much the minimum that we are hoping for. But if we do achieve the carbon neutrality, that in literal terms means that we are saving 60% of the world's population from the mental health effects of climate change. And of course, I can go into a lot of details, but it's best that we read scientific papers that actually establish how this works. The second thing is the physical effects. In terms of physical effects, it's talking about infectious diseases. So climate change is actually impacting the rate at which different vectors that carry infectious diseases are traveling across the world and are actually impacting the ethnic minorities in villages, in city nations, and even religious minorities in Southeast Asia. If the vectors decrease because of carbon neutrality and the changes in the ozone layer, the changes in our weather patterns, we're decreasing the rate of infectious diseases, of malaria, of typhoid. Less and less people are going to die. So I think it's a sad reality. It will save only some of us, or it will delay the worst repercussions. A lot more needs to happen.
Thank you, Elisa. I can't agree more. A lot needs to happen. So we will go on to the next session now. If I could have my slides. So we're trying to move to the workshop session. We actually planned a better engaging and interactive session, but because of the social distancing rules, we have to sort of curb it and pare it down really to the minimum. So sorry about that. So I want to look at the 4 goals of the UK COP26. So this is what you will find on their website. That was the link before. So this is what the UK government says. What do we need to achieve at COP26? So the number 1 is mitigation. So secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And from Dr. Martin Mills' talk this morning, it doesn't look like this can happen in Tibet or on the Tibetan Plateau or on the third plateau. In fact, from what he has said, it's almost like nature is so furious that it's unleashing this almost a monster against man, in fact, about man's unchecked exploitation of nature and our selfish behavior. So number 2 is adaptation. Adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. So adaptation, so if things are going to change on the Tibetan Plateau, again, I would go back to Dr. Martin Mills' talk about how the things that happen on the Tibetan Plateau doesn't affect just the 6 million Tibetan people. It affects 1.4 billion people in Asia, and then it goes beyond that and affects 4 billion people of the world. Is that right?
Well, it's 225 million people in the third pole region at the moment, not just 6 million Tibetans.
Right.
Within those water basins that come out of the rivers that are being increasingly destabilized, you're looking at 1.9 billion people. If you look at the products that come out of those regions, the food, the rice, the wheat, the corn, the products of industry, yes, you're talking about half the world's population. We all know how much India and China produce for us in this country.
Right.
So, and I didn't actually even take into account the fact of what happens to the populations that have to move. We are looking at mass.
Right. Yeah. And I would also refer to the talk by Jo Walton, where she showed us clips about people at the front line, how they are doing little things to make it better for themselves. The solar-powered mobile clinic. I mean, I could imagine those on the Tibetan Plateau. I don't know if it's a feasible idea or not, but we have plenty of sun, and it's hard to get around on the Tibetan Plateau. So, and healthcare is also a big issue. So when you showed that, it sort of came into my mind, this could be something that, could be adopted by other communities. So the work of the communities and the groups that you work with at Ashton, I think they show us a good example on adaptation. And the third is finance. So I don't know much about that, but I know the UK government has the former Governor of Bank of England, Mark Carney, working on that. And I wish he would give some money to us to work on the Tibetan Plateau to make it better sooner rather than later. And then the number 4 is collaboration. Work together to deliver. And this is what we're asking for. This is the main message of our event here. We need to work together. The international community has ignored the issues of the Tibetan people and the Tibetan Plateau, and you no longer can afford to do that. So collaborate with us. Listen to the voices of the Tibetan. Listen to the nature and its changes on the Tibetan Plateau. It can only benefit all of us. So these are the 4 broad themes that we are looking at. And then now I would invite the audience to come up and give us their suggestions, their ideas about how we can take the Tibetan issue to fit into those big goals of the UK government's presidency at COP26 so that it can move the government here, the people here, and international community to give voice to the Tibetan issues. I would also make this an opportunity for those who haven't had the chance to ask questions before to ask them as well. Dr. Mills and Joe Walton has very kindly stayed with us until now, so they're also available here. So we had given out some charts and color pens to the young children to share their thoughts. It could be in writing, it could be in drawing. So can the children come here, please? Where we have the mic, and you can show us your work if you don't want to say anything. If you want to say something, that's better. Oh, I can see a lot of chart papers up there. Oh, is that Noryang? Yes. Noryang and Tsiring, are you coming together? Very good, yes. Let's start with the... Oh, that's very encouraging. Everyone's queuing up to come in front. So please do come.
I'm excited to see. Lovely.
Oh, I wish we could focus on the children here, if it's possible at all. They have done some beautiful drawing.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. Oh.
Amazing.
Okay, maybe then turn around and you want to show? Is that how?
Yeah. Some really powerful illustrations.
Oh, thank you, children. That's beautiful. And for those of you watching us, these are children who meet every Sunday, and they're also part of the social bubble, so we're not breaking any COVID rules here. Oh, thank you. Did anyone want to say anything, children?
No, everyone's...
No? Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're going to take all of what you have drawn, and it will be kept in the office, I think, and much cherished. Thank you.
Well done.
So now we move on to the adults. So the first opportunity will be for Representative Sonam Frazila. I had to stop him asking question earlier this morning. So if you want to ask your question now. Oh, sorry about that. But
my really sort of question was to Joe Walton. You encourage our children here to set up eco clubs if they don't have. And what I really wanted to ask you was, can you give them some guidance on setting up an eco club if they don't have in the school, and how can they portray or take the message of Tibet into them so that they don't totally feel out of place when they do it, so it could help in such a, you could.
Thank you. Sorry, I feel a bit rude. My back to the person that asked me the question. But there are lots and lots of resources online that children and their teachers and parents can access to help you. I showed the film with that school that had won a national award. There are lots and lots of schools that have set up eco clubs. There's the there's Transform Our World, which is a fantastic resource. It's got so many resources that teachers, parents, and children can use to help them work out how to set up an eco club. There's also there's a national, the name of it's gone clean out of my mind, but there's a national scheme for green schools that any school can join. And all of those schemes will have the steps that you need to take to get your school started. But you can start with really baby steps. It doesn't have to be big and grand and expensive. It just takes a couple of you to use your voice, maybe to go and find a teacher who is sympathetic, talk to them, ask them if you could maybe talk about it at an assembly. Talk about it, see who else wants to join in. And you can self-organise. It doesn't have to be something that's imposed on you by adults. It's something that kids can do for themselves. And if you look at the Strikes for Future, the Friday Strikes movement, that is children and young people self-organising. And I think we have to recognise that children are amazingly resourceful and really good at understanding the threat and finding a way to respond to it. So, as I said, go online, but make it up, do it yourselves. You actually know what needs to be done, but just have faith that you're doing the right thing for yourselves and your future children.
Thank you, Jen. So, adults or even children, if you want to give us suggestions and recommendations on how we need to move beyond the 2 days event to take us to COP26, or any questions that you have for the panel that you didn't had the chance to raise before.
Well, if there isn't, I'll make a small suggestion or question that, many families have got small gardens, yes, and how do you use best use of the garden plants to improve the environment, or destroy the environment by having so many little barbecues? So is these barbecues, which we love to have, we can't resist. We need to have a little barbecue, but so how much damage these barbecues will have or doesn't have? Are we allowed to have barbecues or not? That's the thing.
Lifestyle choices, Ugela. Okay, who would like to add to that or respond to that?
I'm happy to address this. I totally understand, because Sunday barbecues are very common in my family. My dad loves hosting barbecues. In terms of the damage of hosting a barbecue, it's not that much, because it depends also, of course, on our consumption. What are we consuming? Meat, beef, chicken. And I think this is a known fact without doubt that if you reduce your meat consumption, if you turn to vegetarianism, that will have a significant impact on reducing carbon emissions and actually reducing your carbon footprint. So I think it is time that we stagger away from our heavy meat diets. Of course, I'm not saying that from tomorrow onwards none of you should have meat. It's slow steps. It took me a while, and now, I'll have chicken once in a day, very small portion, and the rest is vegetables or more natural carbs or dairy products. And again, every day I'm evaluating what choices are realistic for me to achieve. And if I tell myself that, okay, I have to cut this out, it's almost too much pressure on myself, and it feels like I'll reach a breaking point where I'll end up doing nothing at all. So I think if you said to people, stop hosting barbecues, it will be quite overwhelming. And the truth is that hosting fewer barbecues is better than hosting no barbecues at all. And the damage of these barbecues is much less in comparison to what you're wearing. So I would say stop buying new clothes unless you really actually genuinely need them. Go for eco-conscious brands. Look at the way that they were produced and whether they're ethically sourced. We can do a lot at the same time by taking or participating in gardening. indoor gardening both play a huge role in terms of how they offset the carbon that we produce or the plants or trees that they will grow into. And it's a hobby that I think every young person should participate in. My fiance's dad, my father-in-law, loves gardening, and I think it's going to bring me close to nature even more so. I've always lived in cities, and so I've never really had the connection with nature. I've never really gardened myself, and so I don't know the first thing about, which plant is the best for the environment. But as I'm speaking more and more and actually immersing myself in this natural environment and learning more about plants, if I had 2 indoor potted plants, it's doing so much more to my carbon footprint and offsetting it. And if I was doing much more about my weekly diets and about what I'm wearing, again, it's making a big impact if you combine that across my annual year consumption. So definitely keep that in mind. Increase indoor gardening, outdoor gardening, and reduce the number of barbecues, but specifically reduce your meat consumption.
Thank you. Any more questions? Did I see a hand here? Okay, Martin, did you? Oh, okay, Dalala. Sorry. Dalala.
My question is about the Tibet, the third pole. If Tibet is that important environmentally, but WWF is not in Tibet, Friends of Earth is not in Tibet. Only organization, international organization, which is in Tibet, working closely with government of China is ECMOD. And how ECMOD's, when you see ECMOD's thing, all those adaptation, finance, deliverance, it's their promise. How their promise is, how they are meeting their promise, I want to hear from experts, particularly Martin Mills, Doctor. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a tricky question. Okay, I can't speak for ICIMOD, obviously. For those of you who don't know, ICIMOD is the, I'm going to try and get the acronym right here, the Integrated Mountain Development. Yes. Yeah. Works out of Kathmandu. Produced the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment of 2019, which is quite a large 600-page document, which is incredibly informative to read, I would say, if you are prepared to read all 600 pages, but they have nice summaries. So your question is that I would say that, ICIMOD certainly work on the Tibetan Plateau, and it is obviously, as we've discussed already here, it's a difficult political territory to work in. Because while we all care about political differences, nature doesn't. It doesn't care about the borders. It doesn't care about, who owns what land. Land is land, and it just does what it does. I'm personally quite a fan of ICIMOD. I'm quite a fan of ICIMOD in the way that I was also the fan of Akong Rinpoche's work, which was a difficult work to do. It's difficult to work across those borders. It is difficult to attain the political processes that are required. I am inclined, because as you've probably spotted, I'm a pessimist. I'm not terribly well inclined to think that the human race is actually fully capable of dealing with what it has unleashed. We'll be lucky if we are up to surviving it. And that, to my mind, is one of our principal goals. Adaptation is one of our principal goals because we are actually demonstrating ourselves to be not very good at mitigation. I like COP26. I hope to God that they achieve something. I don't expect them to. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but there are simply too many processes. Even 1.5 degrees is a negotiation between human beings. It's a compromise, but nature does not compromise. It doesn't come up with a compromise and say, oh, you know, you'd all like to have cars, and you'd all like to have trains, and you'd all like to have fridges, and you'd all like to have all of these things, and you'd all like to have this amount. So tell you what, I'll meet you halfway. It doesn't do that. Once, as we have been discussing, once you get above 0 degrees centigrade, ice turns to water. It's not going to say, tell you what, I'll change my mind, and I'll go for 1.5 degrees above zero. Okay, so these things don't happen, and there are questions about politics, and Isimod has to work with politics, just as Akon Rinpoche had to work with politics. But the truth of the matter is those political organizations are only as good as we let them be. And a lot of that comes down to, and we can't afford to push this onto large political organizations, because politicians will only, politics is the art of the possible. And the possible is the permission that comes from us. But it is also about what we do in our everyday lives. So we can think about those organizations and worry about it. I personally am, as I say, I'm quite a fan, because I look at the work they do and it seems to be scientifically entirely valuable. And I'm a bit of a geek and a scientist as far as that's concerned. So I think that's fine, and they do that work. And I think we have to work across borders. When it comes to the Tibetan Plateau in particular, we have to have international monitoring. And we have to have organizations that have made the footstep that start that process. So yes, I'm good as far as that's concerned, just as I was good with what Akon Rinpoche did. And with reference to that, as far as that's concerned, by the way, and going back to the previous question, I'm going to steal my moment here to transfer a piece of wisdom that Akon Rinpoche himself came up with. He said, when it comes to the amount of meat that you need to eat, meat is medicine. How much medicine do you eat? Human beings need it for things like metal, for things like our iron content in our blood and everything on those lines. But no, we generally do not need nearly as much as we eat. So we should think of meat that way, as medicine. That would be the goal. That is a rational approach to this question. Rather than simply going, do I do a lot or a little? You take as much meat as keeps you healthy. And that actually isn't that much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think, sorry, can you make it very brief? I'm already running over time.
Yeah, 60 seconds.
Okay, sorry.
This notion that we need to partner with someone who breaks into my house as a criminal, I need to partner with him in a public-private partnership. How ludicrous is that? I'm not going to partner with a criminal. I'm going to prosecute them. I'm going to take them to the High Court. I'm going to hold them accountable. But why would I partner with a criminal that says that you have to transition to a net zero world, that have got all these goals that are just virtue signaling with no visions at the end of it, that tells us that our indigenous medicines are just quackery and there's no scientific basis, especially the faiths which is going back before Christ for 5,000 years. What's really going on here? Because why? I really don't get the answers given, because it's completely abusing my religious and indigenous beliefs. And can anyone explain to me, when that whole forest that has been there hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's got a whole ecosystem for those indigenous people, the Nagi Valley tribe people, the Adivasis, and we've removed, as I've seen in the photos and the maps, small and small plots of land being surrounded by mines. They're being completely desiccated and removed. And you can do the geology report of the mines. And then we're saying we need to do better. We need to partner. Partner with what? BlackRock? the company that owns 60% of the world's resources, and every single company, Pepsi and Coke, partner with them? Like, what, I'm gonna invite the criminal? Here's the gold that you didn't find in the safe. No, the answers given are not tenable. The United Nations are agencies, government Quango international agencies. They fund off our taxes. They're accountable to the government bodies. That's funded by my pocket. So here's a real serious question. It's not just about the rights of the Tibetan people, it's the rights of Balochistan, wherever.
Right.
What the hell are we doing? Like, seriously, where are people going to grow food when all the dharti, the soil, is removed? And as one guy in the stock exchange told me, when you've got 100 feet down, don't expect to grow anything.
That's right. Yeah.
So you're mining minerals for the lithium, for the solar panels, and actually say, let's partner with the criminals. But when you want the apples, then you have to go to Monsanto because they're going to grow it in a lab. Sorry, no, that's just ridiculous answers, and we better come up with better than that. And yes, I'm going to use the keynote from the lady who was talking about the activism, but unfortunately, the activism I'm going to have to do is not against the UN agencies. Is it the people against the people who are claiming to be the activists against climate change? Right. And shake them by the throat and actually tell them, what the hell are you doing? Are you working for the government clangos? Are you working for the people of Pakistan or India? The sovereign people, the sovereign men and women, not those tailcoats who are just virtue signaling, we're doing this for you.
Thank you, sir.
Rape of the women. You know, people are saying, stand up for the women. Well, here's my spiel. Arrest those people. Full stop. If someone wants to rape a woman, boom, that's it. Yeah. Arrest them.
Thank you.
Rich Quangos? Come on. Seriously. Yeah. Better answers.
Yeah. Thank you, Sagar. You've raised a series of questions that we would have to ponder hard and long. Thank you very much for that. And I would bring the session to an end here. This is just the talking part of the session. I want to thank the 4 speakers today, Dr. Martin Mills, Joe Walton, Tilechuki, and Eliza Ayas. I think because of your presence here, we are going home better informed, more empowered, and I would strongly recommend to the audience to read the research work of Dr. Martin Mills on his website. To further understand in more depth the issues that affect the third pole, and also Joe Walton's organization, the charity Ashton, to look at things that we can do and about other people who are in the same position as us. And Tilechuki, of course, for giving us an insight into the work of the Tibetan people and Central Tibetan administration in raising the issue of the Tibetan people and the rights of the Tibetan people at the United Nations. And last but not the least, Eliza Ayas for her inspirational talk. I mean, just your presence here, I think would inspire many of us, hopefully the youngsters, to do more, and probably it'll open up new ideas and encourage them to be part of a global movement for climate action. With this, I now pass on the mic to Tenzin Zedenla. Thank you.
Thank you, Lojala. Tashdile, hello everybody. Before I start thanking all, I would like to say something. Many Tibetans, like me, being born in exile and not in Tibet, do not have first-hand information about our country, Tibet. But we have seen it through our grandparents and our parents and our older generation eyes, which I'm afraid the breathtakingly beautiful picture which we have created in our mind through listening to the stories and songs which we have heard about it. which we have been hearing about it, will not, it's very hard to come true because Tibetan Plateau is in very critical condition. Its grassland, glacier, rivers are vanishing at an alarming rate, as our speakers have explained to you before. Tibet is not a free country, which makes it more difficult situation. Tibet inside Tibet cannot stand against the environment destruction being taken place and cannot demand for safeguarding its environment strongly because if they do, they have to face repression and imprisonment. So we living in free country, it is our responsibility to raise our voice in the free country to the world leadership so that it is being discussed in every forum and important meetings. Drastic steps need to be taken urgently as Tibet climate issue is very significant to the world climate change. I hope you all have gained relevant information and learned so much about Tibet environment through this conference. And we are so happy that we are able to organize this 2 days conference on Tibetan Plateau, the third pole. Lastly, on behalf of Office of Tibet and Tibet House Trust, I would like to heartily thank all the speakers who are present here and who joined virtually for their wonderful, interesting talk, for sharing their perspective in detail, and to have a productive discussion. And we thank Royal Geographical Society for allowing us to hold our event at this great venue, and its team for making sure that all COVID safety measures are maintained throughout the conference, which is very important for everybody's health. And of course, its technical team for helping us with the audiovisual related work. And our many thanks to our volunteers for their help, which has made us to manage it much easier. And last but not the least, many thank you to audience for their interest, for joining us here, and for their interesting questions, which really make discussion very productive, constructive. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Tuchina. Now, may I request our representative, Mr. Sundam Farsila, because we are offering a katak to our speakers, Dr. Martin and Joanna Walton and Elisa. May I request first Dr. Martin Mills. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to request Joanna Walton. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to request Alice. Thank you.